It was late August 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the northern part of Idaho, near the Canadian border. I was 31 at the time and working remotely as a freelance graphic designer. I had spent most of the summer stuck in my apartment in Spokane, Washington, working long hours, barely leaving the place except to grab groceries or take short walks. I had promised myself I'd take at least one proper break before the summer ended. I wanted something quiet, just trees, air, and time to myself without screens or schedules. I picked a spot about 4 hours away, just past Bonner's Ferry, near a lake called Hidden Pine Lake. It was a small, not-so-popular area. I found it on a backcountry hiking forum. Someone had mentioned that the lake had great trout fishing and very few people ever went up there because it wasn't officially maintained by the Forest Service anymore. The trail was still walkable, but barely marked. That sounded perfect to me. I packed up my gear the night before: my tent, sleeping bag, a week's worth of dehydrated food, my camping stove, bear spray, first aid kit, a good flashlight with extra batteries, and my old aluminum water bottle. I also had my survival knife, a multi-tool, and a small hatchet. Everything went into my old Kelty 65-liter backpack. I had done several solo hikes before, though none quite this remote, but I felt confident. I told my friend Kyle where I was going and when I planned to be back, just in case. I left early in the morning and made it to the gravel forest road by around noon. From there, it was about a 2-mile drive on a narrow dirt path to the trailhead, which was just a clearing with an old wooden signpost barely standing. It was cracked and hard to read, but I could still make out the words Pine Ridge Trail. The hike itself was about 6 miles uphill, mostly switchbacks through pine forests and along the edge of a dry creek bed. I saw deer tracks, some bird feathers, and a few old boot prints. Nothing fresh. It looked like nobody had been out there in a while. By the time I got to the lake, it was late afternoon. The sun was just starting to angle down through the trees, giving everything that golden glow that only happens late in the day. The lake was beautiful, clear, and still, surrounded by pine-covered slopes and rocky ledges. There were a couple of flat areas near the shoreline perfect for a tent. I picked a spot about 50 feet from the water under some trees and started setting up camp. Everything went smooth the first night. I cooked up a freeze-dried pasta meal and sat by the water watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep purple. There was no wind, no animals, no sound but the occasional splash of a fish jumping. It was peaceful. I fell asleep quickly and slept hard. The second day, I spent most of the morning exploring the lake's perimeter. It was probably only about 1.5 miles around, but the terrain was uneven and rocky, and parts were thick with undergrowth. I saw a few animal tracks, elk, maybe even a mountain lion, but nothing that looked too recent. I didn't see any bear signs, which was good. I fished for a while that afternoon and caught 2 decent-sized trout, which I cooked for dinner. I had brought seasoning packets and a small pan, and it was one of the best meals I'd had in months. I started to feel that calm sense of detachment that comes when you've been away from people long enough, like the world had shrunk to just me, the trees, and the water. But that night, something woke me up. It was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. I didn't have a clock, but I could tell it was deep into the night by how dark and still everything was. At first, I thought it was the sound of something moving through the trees, but it wasn't a loud noise. It was soft, steady, like a footstep, then a pause, then another. Not fast or frantic, just slow and deliberate. I lay there in my sleeping bag, my eyes wide open. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound was maybe 30 or 40 feet from my tent, up the slope a bit in the tree line. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath. A minute passed. Nothing. Then I heard a single sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight. I sat up and quietly reached for my flashlight and the knife I kept by my sleeping pad. I didn't turn the light on. I didn't want to give away my position if someone or something was watching. I just sat there listening. My heart was racing, and I felt my chest tighten like it was being squeezed. After another 5 or 10 minutes, I didn't hear anything else. No more movement, just silence. Eventually, I lay back down, still holding the knife. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked up the slope where I thought the sound had come from. I didn't find anything unusual. No fresh tracks, No broken branches, nothing obvious. I figured maybe it had been a deer or elk passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I told myself I'd stay one more night and then head back a day early. That day was colder, windier. The lake didn't look as peaceful. The water had a rough texture to it, and the trees swayed loudly. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I wasn't alone. That evening, I skipped fishing. I didn't want to stay near the water once it got dark. I just heated up a pouch of beef stew and stayed close to the fire. I added more wood than usual, letting it burn higher and brighter than I normally would, just for the light. As the night went on, I started hearing sounds again. Not footsteps this time, more like faint rustling. Too rhythmic to be wind, but too soft to be an animal crashing through undergrowth. It would come and go in short bursts. I kept my flashlight in my hand the whole time. Once or twice, I turned it on and swept the trees, but there was never anything there. Just before I went into the tent, I looked around and noticed something strange. There was a thin vertical scratch on one of the trees near my camp. It wasn't deep, but it was fresh. Pale bark exposed under the darker outer layer, about 5 feet off the ground. I ran my fingers over it. It didn't feel like claw marks, more like a blade or something metal had done it. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my bag listening, every nerve on edge. Just before dawn, I heard another sound, this time closer. A rustle right outside my tent, followed by the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the nylon. I froze. It didn't last more than a second. Just a touch, then silence. I waited until the sky started to turn gray, then quietly unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The fire pit was cold, and the woods were dead quiet. I circled the tent and found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, not boots, bare feet. They were faint, but I could see the outline in the loose dirt. A heel and arched toes. No shoes, no tread, just human feet. They were small too, maybe a size 7 or 8. And they had come from the trees and stopped right beside my tent, then turned around and left in the direction of the creek bed I had passed on the hike in. I broke camp in under an hour. I didn't eat, didn't pack neatly, just stuffed everything into the backpack and took off. I kept looking back over my shoulder every few minutes as I moved down the trail. I took my knife out and held it in my hand as I walked. My legs burned, my shoulders ached, but I didn't stop. When I reached the trailhead clearing, I almost cried. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear in the back and drove out of there without even taking off my boots. That was over 7 years ago now. I haven't been back to that area since. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone anymore. And never without telling at least 2 people where I'm going and when I'll be back. I don't know who or what was up there with me, but I know it wasn't a hiker. It wasn't a hunter. No sane person hikes 6 miles up a forgotten trail barefoot in the middle of the night, sneaks around someone's tent, and vanishes without a sound. My best guess? Someone was living up there. Someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe someone who'd been up there a long time. Long enough to forget how to live around people. Long enough to not care. Whatever the reason, they knew I was there. They watched me. They came close. And for some reason, they let me leave. I don't care why. I'm just glad they did. I was 29 when I decided to do my first solo camping trip. It was October 2022, and the leaves in southern Oregon had started to turn. I lived in a small town outside of Medford, and I'd always enjoyed the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, stuff like that. But I'd never spent a night alone out in the woods. I'd done some camping trips with friends in the past, but I wanted to push myself a little. I felt like I needed the silence. My job at the time was wearing me out. Just long shifts at a landscaping supply company, constantly loading trucks and sorting pallets. I figured getting away for a weekend would do me some good. I'd picked a quiet spot near Tulie Lake, close to the California border. It wasn't a big campground or anything, just a stretch of forest near the water with a few fire pits and some clearings. No park rangers, no real trails, no cell signal. That was part of the appeal. I parked my old Subaru at the end of a logging road around noon on Friday and hiked my gear down about a mile through the trees until I found a little flat area that looked out over the water. It was completely silent except for the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I dropped my backpack and just stood there for a while, letting the quiet settle in. I had a basic setup: tent, sleeping bag, folding camp chair, a cooler with a couple of sandwiches and water bottles, and a little propane stove for coffee. I wasn't planning on doing much, just relaxing, maybe reading a little, and enjoying being away from the noise of town. By 4 p.m., I had the tent set up and a small fire going. I sat on a rock near the edge of the slope, eating a turkey sandwich and looking out at the lake. The water was completely still, like glass, and the hills on the far side were covered in dark pine and yellowing maple. A few clouds drifted overhead, and the light was starting to change. Everything was kind of golden and peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up for a bit by the fire, watching the flames and listening to the forest sounds. It was colder than I expected, and I was glad I'd packed a thermal liner for my sleeping bag. I slept a little restlessly, though. Not because I was scared or anything, just because it was so quiet. You start to notice every little sound out there, every twig cracking or squirrel rustling in the leaves. The next morning, I got up early, made some instant coffee, and took a short walk around the area. I didn't go far, just up a nearby hill and down toward the lake. The ground was damp with dew, and my boots left clear prints in the soft dirt. I noticed a few animal tracks here and there, deer mostly, and found a little cove with some fallen logs where I sat for a while, just watching the water. It was one of those places that didn't feel like it had changed in 100 years. No power lines, no distant hum of cars, just trees and sky and silence. I went back to camp around mid-morning, read a few chapters of a paperback I'd brought, and made some oatmeal on the stove. Around noon, I decided to explore a bit more. I didn't have any kind of strict plan, just a general idea of following the slope downhill and circling back along the shoreline. I packed some snacks and water, left the tent and gear as it was, and started walking. First, it was easy. The slope was gradual, and there was a sort of natural path where the underbrush had thinned out. I followed it for maybe a quarter mile before the terrain got trickier. More rocks, steeper drop-offs, and a thicker tangle of fallen branches. I had to slow down, watching my footing as I stepped over mossy logs and around thorny bushes. That's when I noticed something a little strange. There were boot prints in the mud. Not mine, they were bigger and spaced differently, and the tread was different. I crouched down to look at them and saw that they were fairly recent, maybe from that morning or the day before. They headed in the same general direction I was going. I figured it was just another camper or maybe a hunter. It wasn't that weird, I told myself, even though I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead and hadn't heard a single voice or engine since I'd arrived. I kept moving, but now I was more alert. The forest felt different somehow, still quiet, but not peaceful. It was like the silence had thickened.
No birds, no squirrels rustling.
Just the sound of my own boots and breath. I walked for another hour, slowly making my way back uphill, and that's when I saw it. There was a torn blue tarp caught on a tree branch up ahead. I moved closer and found what looked like an abandoned camp. There was a fire pit full of blackened wood, a couple of crushed beer cans, and some rotting trash scattered around. The tarp had once been part of a makeshift shelter. It had collapsed on one side, and the ropes had come loose. Everything looked like it had been left in a hurry. There were socks and a damp sleeping bag tossed on the ground, half buried in leaves. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. Something about the scene bothered me deeply. I've seen messy camps before, but this one didn't look like someone had just left after a rough night. It looked like someone had run. There was a ripped shirt hanging from a low branch, and one of the beer cans was crushed flat like it had been stepped on. I started backing away, feeling that cold tightness in my gut. I didn't want to be near that place anymore. I turned and retraced my steps as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The light was already starting to fade through the trees, and the way back was harder to follow. Everything looked different in the dimming light, and more than once I had to stop and get my bearings. When I finally saw the outline of my own tent in the distance, I felt this huge wave of relief. But that relief didn't last long. As I got closer, I saw that something was off. The tent flap was open. I was sure I'd zipped it shut before leaving, and the folding chair I'd placed next to the fire pit had been knocked over. I froze, staring at the scene from behind a tree. I couldn't hear anything, but I waited there, heart thudding in my chest, for at least 10 minutes before I moved closer. I approached slowly, listening. There were no footprints, nothing obvious disturbed except the tent. I leaned down and looked inside. My sleeping bag was there, my pack was there, but someone had gone through it. Things were out of place. My flashlight had been taken out and was lying on the floor, and the zipper on the front pocket was wide open. It hadn't been like that when I left. At that point, I had a choice: stay another night or pack up and go. I didn't even think about it. I started breaking camp immediately, rolling up the sleeping bag, shoving everything into my pack, and dousing the fire pit. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out of the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely tie the straps. It was almost dark by the time I made it back to the car. The sun had dipped behind the hills, and the forest was filling with shadows. I didn't stop to rest. I just walked, as fast as I could, straight up the slope and through the trees. Every snapping twig behind me made me whip my head around. When I finally reached the car and slammed the door shut, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. I didn't even take off my boots. I just started the engine, backed up onto the logging road, and drove away with the headlights bouncing through the trees. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not really. Just said the trip had been cut short by weather. I don't think anyone really noticed how shaken I was. I didn't sleep that night, even in my own bed. I just kept thinking about those boot prints, that abandoned camp, the unzipped pack. A week later, I looked up missing persons in Jackson County. There was a short article about a man in his 40s who had been last seen hiking alone near Applegate Lake back in August, 2 months before I went out there. No foul play suspected, just another person who walked into the woods and didn't walk out. I never went back. I still hike sometimes, but only during the day and never alone. I don't need to know what happened out there. I already know enough. Someone else had been nearby, someone who didn't want to be found, and I was lucky enough to leave before I found out why. I was 34 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the North Cascades. It was mid-September 2017, and the air was starting to get that early autumn chill that reminded me of being young. I'd been working nonstop that year, long hours at my job in Seattle, barely seeing the sun some weeks. I needed to reset my mind, clear the noise, and be somewhere quiet. I didn't want company, no one tagging along, just me and the forest. I thought being alone in the woods for a few days would help me unwind. I had no idea how wrong I was. I chose a place that wasn't too popular but still had decent trails and designated camping spots, the Seattle River Valley area. Most people went farther north or to more well-known spots like Mount Baker, so I figured I'd get some good solitude. I checked the weather, and it was mostly dry with some chances of light rain at night. Nothing to worry about. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, headlamp, first aid kit, bear spray, map, GPS, and a solar charger for my phone. I liked being prepared. I parked at the trailhead around noon after a long, winding drive up the forest roads. There were no other cars around. That made me feel both excited and a little cautious. I had 3 nights planned, each one at a different camp spot along a loop trail that I mapped out based on topography and distance. I locked my car, shouldered my pack, and headed in. The first day was perfect. It was cool, quiet, and calm. The trail was a little overgrown in places, but clearly marked. I followed it steadily through pine forest, over a few wooden bridges crossing clear running creeks, and past giant moss-covered boulders. I saw fresh deer tracks, and once I heard something big moving through the brush to my right, but I never saw what it was. Just normal forest sounds. That night, I made camp in a small clearing about 6 miles in. I was surrounded by tall, thin trees and thick underbrush. I set up my tent on a slight slope, but not enough to make it uncomfortable. I made a small fire in the fire ring left by previous campers, boiled water for my dehydrated food, and sat back against a log to eat. My muscles were tired in a good way. I felt far away from everything stressful. The fire crackled softly, and the sky went from pink to gray to pitch black. I heard owls and the occasional rustling in the trees, probably raccoons or porcupines. I slept well that night, wrapped in my bag, with only the light patter of rain starting around 3 a.m. The next day, I hiked another 7 or 8 miles. The trail followed the river for a while, and then it climbed steeply through rocky terrain. I had to use my hands a few times to scramble over large roots and slippery stones. It was harder going, and I started feeling more alone. I hadn't seen a single soul since I left the parking area, and now the trail felt less defined. Still, I followed the topographic map I'd marked and reached my second camp by mid-afternoon. This one was more remote, higher in elevation, and had a small clearing with views of a distant ridge. The river below sounded faint now, more like white noise in the background. That evening, I didn't bother with a fire. It had started to drizzle, and the ground was too damp to get anything going without a struggle. I ate under the vestibule of my tent, zipped everything up, and read a bit by headlamp before falling asleep. The forest felt thicker here, darker even before the sun fully went down. I remember waking up once in the middle of the night to the sound of a snapping twig, loud and close, but I told myself it was an animal and went back to sleep. I was used to that by now. On the third day, things started to feel different. Not wrong exactly, just off. I hiked through more rugged terrain, climbing gradually into higher elevations, and crossed some rock slides that covered parts of the trail. I was slow and careful, but the fog made visibility poor, and the GPS kept glitching. Twice I had to stop and really study the terrain around me to get back on track. It was colder too. I kept my fleece and rain shell on all day. I reached the third camp area around 4 p.m. It was the most remote spot of the loop. No clearings, no obvious fire ring, just a flat space between trees near a trickling stream. I set up my tent, got water, ate quickly, and got inside before the drizzle turned into real rain. That night I had trouble sleeping. The wind picked up, rattling the tent, and I kept hearing odd thumps in the distance. They weren't footsteps exactly, but they weren't random either. They came in patterns, like something walking or shifting its weight. I told myself it was wind knocking branches together. Still, I kept the bear spray next to my sleeping bag. At around 3 a.m., I heard something that made me freeze. A distinct tearing sound, like fabric being ripped, but not from inside the tent. From a distance, but close enough to hear clearly. Stopped, and everything went dead silent. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then, nothing. No more sounds. Eventually, I drifted back into a restless sleep. The morning brought heavy fog and the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. I broke camp quickly and started the hike back. It was supposed to be around 9 miles to complete the loop and return to my car. I figured I'd get there by early afternoon if I kept a steady pace. The trail was harder to follow than before. The fog made the landscape look unfamiliar, and several markers I remembered seeing before were gone. Small cairns, bits of ribbon, even scratched tree bark that usually helped with orientation. I started to feel uneasy. I double-checked the map, the GPS, everything, but something wasn't adding up. I wasn't moving in circles, but it felt like the trail kept shifting under me, like I'd take 10 minutes in one direction and then find myself back at a feature I swore I passed an hour ago. At one point, I came to a large fallen log across the path. I didn't remember it being there before. As I climbed over it, I saw something that made my chest tighten. A crushed aluminum can half buried in the dirt. It wasn't mine. It looked old and rusted, but I hadn't seen any other signs of campers for days. Nearby were faint impressions in the mud, maybe boot prints, maybe animal. Couldn't tell, but something about them looked wrong, too wide, too long. I kept walking. My pace picked up. I didn't stop for food. I barely drank water. Every sound made my head snap around. The crunch of leaves, the rustle of brush, distant snapping twigs. At one point, I smelled something faint and strange in the air. Not rot, not animal musk, something more metallic and chemical like burned wire or battery acid. passed quickly, but it stuck in my memory. Sometime around 1 p.m., I came to a spot I absolutely recognized. A stone outcropping with a split pine tree right next to it. I passed it the first day. Relief poured through me. I knew from there it was only another 45 minutes to the trailhead. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. Near the tree was a pile of small objects. Not trash, but placed deliberately. A dead bird, neatly laid across a flat stone. Next to it, an old glove, stiff with age and dirt. And beside that, a metal tin with its lid partly off. I didn't open it. I just stared. The arrangement looked purposeful, too deliberate to be random. I kept moving, fast. My legs ached, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get to my car. When I finally broke through the last section of trees and saw the gravel lot, I almost laughed. My car was still there, untouched. No other vehicles. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and drove. As I rolled down the forest road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing followed me. Nothing jumped out. But the unease stayed in my gut like a weight. Back in Seattle, I spent the next few nights unable to sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I heard something outside my window. I never told anyone the full details of what I saw. They'd say it was stress or paranoia, and maybe they'd be right. But here's the thing that stays with me. 2 weeks after I got home, I read an obscure forum post from someone who hiked in the same area and mentioned finding strange offerings in the woods. No explanation, no photos, just a warning to avoid certain places. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. Not because of bears or getting lost. I can handle that. But because out there, in those deep woods, someone else was out there too. Not a monster, not a ghost. Just someone. And the way they moved without being seen, the things they left behind, that was worse than anything supernatural. Because it was real. I went camping alone in September of 2018 in the forests west of Missoula, Montana. I was 32 at the time, working as a freelance photographer, and I just finished a big project for a real estate firm. I needed a break from computer screens, people, and city noise, so I loaded up my Subaru with my gear and drove out to an area I'd only visited once before. A thick forest near Rattlesnake National Recreation Area. I remembered it being quiet and full of trails that led off into more remote spots. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The drive out was smooth, about an hour and a half from my apartment. As I got further away from town, the cell signal dropped off completely. By the time I hit the logging road that would take me the final 10 miles into the woods, the world felt like it had folded in on itself. Trees blocked the sun more than I remembered. Everything was darker, quieter. The dirt road was narrow and overgrown in parts. My tires kicked up dust and pebbles as I drove slowly to avoid any deer or fallen limbs. I passed 2 turnoffs and a dry creek bed before reaching the place I'd marked on my GPS weeks ago. There was no service, of course, so I had to rely on landmarks and memory. I parked in a small clearing just off the path, next to a mossy stump and a half-buried tire someone must have dumped years ago. The forest around me was dense with pine and birch. The floor was carpeted with dead needles, and the air had that cool, damp smell of decaying leaves. I stepped out, stretched, and took a long look around. I didn't see or hear a single person. It was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first hour unloading and setting up camp. I pitched my tent under a stand of trees about 20 yards from the car and laid out my sleeping bag, foam pad, and pack inside. I brought a small cooler, a camp stove, and enough dry food for 3 nights. I also had my camera bag, some basic tools, and a collapsible chair. After everything was set up, I made a small fire pit with rocks, cleared the area around it, and gathered some wood from the surrounding forest. Most of the twigs were damp, but I found enough dry stuff to get a fire going later. By the time the sun began dipping, I was sitting in my chair with a cup of instant coffee, just listening to the woods. A few squirrels darted around, and a couple of birds passed overhead, but otherwise it was dead quiet. Not eerie, just peaceful. I didn't think about anything deep. I just sat there and let myself be still for the first time in weeks. That night, I made a simple meal of canned beans and rice on the stove and sat by the fire until the stars came out. The firelight flickered on the trunks around me, and the sky above was so full of stars it almost didn't seem real. No airplanes, no hum of power lines, just crackling wood and wind in the trees. I stayed up until the fire died out and then went to bed. I woke up twice during the night. The first time was to pee, and everything was quiet. The second time was around 3:30 a.m. when I heard a rustling near the back of my tent. At first I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a deer stepping through the brush. I stayed still and listened. The sound was slow and deliberate, not crashing through the undergrowth like a big animal would. It was soft, like something stepping carefully. After maybe 10 seconds, it stopped completely. I sat up in my sleeping bag and waited. Nothing. No more sounds. I eventually laid back down, telling myself it was probably a porcupine or something else small and curious. Still, I kept my knife in my hand as I drifted off again. The next morning, everything looked normal. I checked around the tent but didn't see any tracks. The ground was mostly packed pine needles, so I wouldn't have seen prints anyway. Still, I felt a little on edge. I tried to shake it off. I made oatmeal and coffee, then packed up my camera gear for a day hike. I planned to follow a game trail I'd noticed yesterday that curved deeper into the woods. I figured I'd get some good photos of moss-covered trees and maybe spot some elk or deer. I left camp around 9 a.m. and walked for nearly 4 hours, stopping often to take pictures. The trail got thinner the further I went, until eventually I was just walking between trees, using a compass and landmarks to keep my bearings. I stopped around 1 p.m. for a snack and sat on a downed tree, chewing a protein bar and drinking water. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. About 20 feet ahead of me, wedged between two rocks at the base of a hill, was a tattered blue tarp. Not mine. It was old, sun-bleached, and partly buried under sticks and leaves, like it had been there for a while. I stood up and walked over slowly, my boots crunching lightly on the forest floor. The tarp was bunched up, but not folded. It looked like it had been stuffed into the space between the rocks. I crouched down and gently pulled a corner back. Underneath was a pile of trash. Empty food wrappers, torn plastic bags, what looked like the edge of a dirty blanket. There were no signs of anyone there now, no smoke or smell, but someone had clearly camped here before, probably a while ago. I didn't want to dig through it. I backed off and decided to turn around. As I started back toward camp, I kept checking behind me. I don't know why. I just felt like someone had been there recently. That tarp didn't look weathered enough to be years old. Maybe someone had been living there during the summer and left when the nights started getting colder. I picked up my pace. I didn't run, but I didn't stop again either. I kept moving until I saw the sun hitting the top of my car through the trees. Back at camp, everything looked untouched. My tent was zipped. My cooler and stove were where I'd left them. Still, that weird feeling stuck with me. I didn't eat much dinner that night, just sat by the fire with my camera and stared into the woods. I went to bed early, around 9 p.m., with my headlamp still clipped to my shirt. Couldn't sleep. I laid there listening to every small sound. A twig snapping, wind brushing the side of the tent, the far-off hoot of an owl. Then, around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up completely. It was a cough. A single, dry cough, not far from my tent. It was faint, but it was definitely human. I froze. My heart started thudding in my chest. I turned off my headlamp immediately and stayed still, barely breathing. The sound hadn't come from far away, maybe 50 feet, maybe less. I waited. Nothing else came. No footsteps, no voice, just silence. I stayed like that for at least 20 minutes, knife in hand, eyes wide open in the dark. Eventually I laid back down, but I didn't sleep at all. I just waited for daylight. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I got up, packed everything as quickly and quietly as I could, and threw it all into the car. I didn't make coffee. I didn't eat. I just wanted to leave. I didn't even collapse the tent properly. I just ripped the poles out and stuffed it in the trunk. I was on the road before the sun was fully up. About 5 miles back down the dirt road, I passed something that made my stomach twist. There were fresh tire tracks on the road, heading in the direction of my camp. They weren't there when I arrived. I would have noticed. They were from a narrow off-road type vehicle, maybe an old truck or a Jeep. The tracks had a thin, deep tread, and they weaved slightly like whoever was driving had been going slow or maybe weaving around ruts. I kept driving, checking the mirror constantly. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and got cell service again. The first thing I did was call a friend back in Missoula and tell him I was on my way to his place. I didn't go home that night. I stayed at his apartment on his couch, not really explaining much. I just said I'd had a weird experience and needed to crash. The next day, I called the local ranger office. I told them about the old tarp, the trash, and the tire tracks. They didn't seem too concerned. They said people camp off the grid all the time, especially out there. Sometimes squatters live in those woods for weeks before moving on. One of them even joked that it was probably just some hermit who didn't want company. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe someone saw me and decided to move on. Maybe they weren't even dangerous. But something about the cough near my tent, how close it was, how deliberate it sounded, still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I haven't camped alone since. I still love the outdoors and I still hike, but I don't stay overnight in remote spots anymore. Not by myself. I learned that it's not the animals or the weather you need to worry about. It's the people, the ones you don't see, but who might be watching from the trees. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 26, working a dead-end office job in Minneapolis, and I thought a break from city life would help clear my head. I picked a spot deep in the Superior National Forest, near the Boundary Waters Canoe area in northern Minnesota, a place known for its dense woods, clear lakes, and mostly quiet wilderness. I wanted something off the beaten path, so I chose a small site by a lake about 4 miles from the nearest ranger station. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water purifier, a first aid kit, a map, compass, and a small hatchet. I left my phone off to avoid distraction, and I told no one exactly where I was going, just that I'd be out in the woods for a few days. The drive up was long, through endless pines and birches, the road slowly turning to gravel and then dirt. When I finally parked near the trailhead, it was early afternoon. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail twisted through thick underbrush and over fallen logs, the ground damp from last week's rain. Mosquitoes buzzed constantly, forcing me to keep my jacket zipped and my hat low. I followed the map carefully, stopping every so often to check the compass. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, mixing with a faint hint of decaying leaves. After about 2 hours, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, still water that mirrored the sky, with a few loons calling in the distance. The campsite was small, just a flat patch near the shore with a fire pit ringed by stones and a cleared area for a tent. No other campers were there, which I liked. I set up my tent slowly, careful to stake it firmly into the soft ground. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees as I finished. I made a fire, piling dry sticks and branches carefully to avoid smoke. The warmth felt good after the long hike. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles with some canned chicken and a small piece of cheese. I ate slowly, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. A distant woodpecker tapping, the gentle lap of waves on the shore, and the occasional rustle of something moving in the bushes. Night fell quickly. The forest grew dark except for the flickering firelight. I felt a mix of peace and unease. Alone in the woods, every sound seemed louder and sharper. An owl hooted somewhere nearby. I double-checked that my hatchet was within reach and that my water purifier was close by. I had a small flashlight, but I kept it off, wanting to preserve the night's natural darkness. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. Something felt off. The forest was silent now, no birds or insects. Even the water's lapping had stopped. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, but there was only silence. Then I heard its slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on dry leaves somewhere just beyond the fire's glow. My heart raced. I grabbed the hatchet quietly and sat very still, eyes fixed on the tree line. The steps stopped. I waited, Then suddenly something moved, a large shape breaking through the shadows between the trees. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it wasn't a deer or a bear. Its gait was too upright, its movements too careful. I thought about shouting, running, or even lighting the flashlight, but I froze. The figure came closer, just at the edge of the firelight, and I saw it was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hood pulled low over his face. He stopped, looking straight at me. I couldn't tell if he was alone or if someone else was behind him. My mind raced. What was he doing here? Was he lost? Or something worse? The man just stood there for what felt like an eternity. I gripped the hatchet tighter, ready to defend myself if needed. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away slowly, back into the trees. The footsteps faded. The sounds of the forest slowly returned, but I didn't move. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening and waiting. Morning came slowly, the sky turning pale blue through the tree branches. I was exhausted, tense, but relieved the man didn't come back. I packed up quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. On the hike back, I stayed alert, scanning the woods constantly. My legs ached, my pack felt heavy, but I moved as fast as I could. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a while, catching my breath. I called the ranger station to report what happened, and they told me there had been a few reports of people trespassing in the area recently. Some looking for places to camp without permits, others less clear about their intentions. They promised to send a patrol through the next day. That night in my apartment, I couldn't sleep well. The memory of those footsteps and the man's silent stare haunted me. But I felt something else too. A strange relief that I had been prepared, that I hadn't panicked, and that I had trusted my instincts. In the weeks after, I read more about camping safety and learned how to better prepare for unexpected situations in the wilderness. I never went camping alone again, but I kept going back to nature, always careful, always ready. The woods were no longer just a place of escape, but a reminder of how quickly things could turn, and how important it was to respect the unknown. It was the summer of 2017, just after I turned 28. I had been wanting to get away from the city for a while. The stress of work, the constant noise, and the endless screens were wearing me down. So I decided to go camping alone for a few days, somewhere quiet and remote. I picked a spot in the northern part of Vermont, near the Green Mountains. The area was known for its dense forests and small, hidden lakes. I had driven past it once on a road trip years ago, and the memory stuck with me. A place that looked untouched, calm, and far from anything. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Friday. The sun was starting to lower, but still gave enough light to find a decent spot for my tent. I had a small backpack with a sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, a knife, matches, and a basic first aid kit. I wasn't planning anything fancy, just a few nights to myself, some fresh air, and quiet. The road into the camping area was rough, mostly dirt with rocks and roots sticking out here and there. I parked my car near a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The trail was barely wide enough for one person, and I could feel the cool smell of pine and damp earth in the air. I started walking with my pack, following the trail uphill. The trees were thick, tall, and green. Occasionally, I could hear birds, but otherwise it was quiet, almost too quiet. After about 20 minutes, I found a small clearing by the side of a slow-moving creek. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. It was the perfect place to set up camp, close to water but still open enough for sunlight to come through the trees. I unpacked my tent, carefully laid out the sleeping bag, and started gathering dry wood for a fire. The air smelled fresh, like rain, though the sky was clear. I noticed how peaceful it was. No sounds from cars or people, just nature. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows. I thought about how far I was from the city, and a calm feeling settled in me. After starting the fire, I sat by it, eating a can of beans and drinking some water. The warmth was comforting as the temperature dropped with the coming night. Later, I took a walk along the creek, shining my flashlight on the path. I kept an eye on the water, watching it move slowly over rocks and fallen branches. There was something about the way the water reflected the firelight that was mesmerizing. I felt at ease and ready to rest. But as the night went deeper, I started to notice small things. Sounds and movements that didn't feel right. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a low crack, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. I lay down in my sleeping bag, the fire now just glowing embers. The night sky was clear, stars shining bright above the tall trees. The silence was almost total, but every now and then, I heard small noises, twigs breaking, the occasional hoot of an owl. The woods felt alive, but I was alone. Around midnight, the noises grew closer. I could hear footsteps, soft but deliberate. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but I hadn't seen any cars on the road or heard any other signs of people nearby. My flashlight was still by the fire, but I didn't want to move. I stayed still, holding my breath. Then the footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. I could see the shadows of the trees, but no clear shape. I tried to listen carefully. The sounds didn't match any animal I knew. They were too heavy, too measured. For the first time, I felt real fear. Not the fun kind you get from a scary story, but a deep, bone-chilling fear of being watched or followed. I wanted to call out, but my voice stuck in my throat. I reached slowly for my knife, feeling its cool handle in my hand. The footsteps moved again, slower now, circling the clearing. My mind raced. Maybe someone was lost or drunk in the woods. Maybe worse. I thought about my phone, but I had no signal here, no bars, nothing. My car was too far and I was on foot. I realized I was vulnerable. I waited, barely breathing, hoping whoever was out there would leave. Minutes passed like hours. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps faded away. The woods grew quiet again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the fire, listening for any sound. The next morning, I packed up quickly, my nerves still on edge. I decided not to stay another night. As I walked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just trees, birds, and the soft light of dawn. When I got to the car, I locked the doors and started the engine. The drive back to the main road was tense. I thought about the footsteps, the quiet fear, and how alone I had felt. It was a sharp reminder that nature is beautiful but unpredictable, and sometimes, people are the real danger. Back in the city, I told myself I would try camping again, but maybe with friends next time. Alone in the woods, you realize how thin the line is between peace and fear. I learned to trust my instincts and to respect the wild not just for its beauty, but for its power to unsettle and remind you how small you really are. The year was 2018, and I was 24 years old. I had planned a solo camping trip in a remote part of northern Idaho, somewhere deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. The spot was off the beaten path, miles from any trailhead or road. I had chosen it because I wanted silence, peace, and to test myself against the wilderness without distractions. No phone signal, no internet, no other people, just me, my gear, and the wild. I arrived at the dirt access road early in the afternoon after a long drive from Spokane. The sky was clear, a bright blue, with only a few fluffy clouds drifting lazily. The air had that crispness you only get at higher elevations in late summer, cool but not cold. Pine trees lined the road, thick and tall, their trunks thick and branches dense. I could smell the resin, the fresh pine scent mixed with earth and a faint trace of smoke from a distant campfire or maybe a cooking fire in the valley below. The sound of birds filled the air, jays calling, woodpeckers tapping on bark, and the occasional high-pitched whistle of a hawk circling above. My plan was to hike a few miles off the road, cross a small creek, and set up camp in a clearing I had spotted on a map the night before. The map was old but still accurate. It showed a small flat area surrounded by thick forest and backed up against a ridge. It wasn't an official campsite, no fire rings, no signs of other campers, just a natural clearing formed by a handful of fallen trees and some sparse grass. I packed light but smart. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated for 30 degrees, a compact stove, canned food, a water filter, a good knife, flashlight, and a first aid kit. I also brought my camera and a notebook, two things I like to use to document my trips and feelings. The hike started easy. The trail was little more than a faint dirt path beneath the underbrush, but it was dry and clear. I stepped carefully over roots and rocks, my boots crunching the dry leaves underfoot. The creek I had to cross was shallow and slow-moving, with clear water tumbling over smooth stones. I took my boots off, rolled up my pants, and waded across, feeling the cold rush of the mountain water bite my skin. The creek bed was slippery, so I moved slow, steady, gripping a fallen branch for balance. On the other side, the clearing opened up, exactly as I had hoped. The ground was soft and grassy, dotted with small wildflowers and shaded by the towering pines. I dropped my pack and took a deep breath. The smell of pine was stronger here, mixed with the faint dampness of the creek nearby. Setting up the tent took me about an hour. I stretched out the nylon fabric and pegged the corners into the soft soil, checking for any rocks or sticks beneath. I arranged my sleeping bag inside and laid out my gear neatly. As the sun moved lower, the light changed, turning golden and then amber as it filtered through the branches. I started a small fire in a cleared circle about 15 feet from the tent, using dry twigs and pine needles. The fire crackled and popped, sending up small sparks that floated and vanished into the darkening sky. I boiled water for some canned chili and ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the warmth. As the light faded completely and the stars took over the sky, I sat back against a log, watching the fire and feeling the cool night air creep in. The forest around me seemed alive with sound, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the flutter of wings as an owl took flight. The smell of smoke, pine, and damp earth wrapped around me like a blanket. I pulled out my notebook and began to write, my thoughts drifting from the day to the peaceful solitude. I wrote about the way the trees bent in the wind, the shape of the clouds, the way the stars seemed close enough to touch. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes grew heavy. I crawled into the tent, zipped the door, and lay on my back, staring up at the fabric roof. The sounds of the forest continued, steady and comforting. But somewhere deep inside me, a tiny feeling began to grow. Not fear, exactly, but unease. It was a prickling at the back of my neck, a whisper of something off, something not quite right. I tried to push it away and drifted to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke suddenly. The tent was darker than I expected, almost pitch black, but I could hear something moving outside. It was a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over leaves and dirt. I froze, heart pounding, straining my ears. The fire had died down hours ago, and the forest felt colder now, the air heavier. I reached out in the dark for my flashlight, fumbling with the buttons until a weak beam cut through the tent wall. Outside, the beam caught on something near the edge of the clearing. A large shape, tall and moving slowly, almost gliding. My breath hitched. I told myself it was probably a deer or elk, maybe a bear. I had seen signs of bears on the trail, scratches on trees, large scat, but nothing close to the camp. Still, the way the figure moved didn't look quite right for an animal. It was too careful, too deliberate, almost like it was watching me. The dragging sound continued, coming closer to the clearing. I stayed as still as I could, trying not to make a sound. I whispered to myself to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe someone else was nearby, another camper or hunter who had wandered off the road. But the area was supposed to be empty. Suddenly, the shape stopped moving, standing just at the edge of the clearing where the tree line thickened. I held my breath. I felt exposed and vulnerable. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the figure disappeared into the trees. The dragging sound faded with it. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the tent, listening, eyes wide open, clutching my flashlight. The forest around me was alive with sounds, but nothing moved near the clearing again. The wind picked up, making the trees creak and groan. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but the thought of hiking in the dark, alone in unfamiliar woods, scared me just as much. At first light, I poked my head outside. The clearing looked peaceful and untouched. No signs of footprints or anything unusual. The ground was dry, the grass bent only from the weight of the morning dew. The creek gurgled gently nearby. I told myself I had imagined it, that fatigue and darkness had played tricks on me. After eating a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area to understand better what I was dealing with. I grabbed my pack and started hiking along the ridge behind the clearing, careful to move quietly and keep an eye out. As I walked, the forest around me thickened. The trees grew closer, their branches intertwining overhead. The trail was faint and narrow, lined with moss and fallen leaves. Occasionally, I found broken branches and flattened grass, signs that animals had passed recently. After about an hour, I came to a small abandoned cabin hidden in the woods. It was old and dilapidated, the wooden walls warped and darkened with age, windows cracked and boarded over. The roof sagged in places, and a rusty metal stove pipe poked through one side. The smell of mold and rot drifted faintly from inside. I approached carefully, feeling a chill despite the warm sun overhead. I circled the cabin, looking for signs of recent human activity. I found none, no footprints, no trash, no fresh firewood. Just the usual signs of decay and time. Something about the cabin unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. It was isolated and forgotten, a relic of some past life long gone. But the dragging sound from the night before echoed in my mind, and I wondered if the figure I had seen could have come from here. I decided to return to camp and pack up. My original plan to stay another night was abandoned. The forest had felt safe in the daylight, but now I was aware of how vulnerable I truly was. That afternoon, I broke camp quickly and started hiking back toward the road. The trail seemed longer and harder going now, the weight of fear and fatigue heavy on my shoulders. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the sky turned a cold gray. I increased my pace, eager to reach my car and the safety of civilization. As I crossed the creek one last time, I stopped and looked back into the woods. The shadows were thick and dark, the silence almost complete. No sounds, no movement, just the steady rush of the creek water. I told myself I was safe now. I had left the clearing behind. The figure, the dragging sound, it had been some kind of animal or a hunter moving through the woods. Whatever it was gone. When I finally reached my car, the headlights of other vehicles on the nearby highway felt like a blessing. The world outside the forest was noisy and bright, filled with people and safety. I locked the doors and sat for a moment, breathing deeply. The tension in my body slowly eased. The forest had tested me, shown me how alone and exposed I could be in the wild. But I had made it through. It was late August of 2019, and I had taken a week off work to finally clear my head. I'd been drowning in stress at my job in Cincinnati, and I needed to be somewhere quiet. No emails, no traffic, no people, just space. I'd always enjoyed the outdoors, especially camping, so I planned a solo trip to Shawnee State Forest in southern Ohio. I'd been there a few times before, but never completely alone. This time, I wanted total isolation. I chose a remote area off one of the lesser-known trails, away from the popular campsites, deeper into the forest where you had to hike a couple of hours just to find a flat spot to pitch a tent. I figured the distance would keep people away, and I was right. I didn't see a single person for the next 3 days. I drove down on a Tuesday morning, left my car in a gravel lot near the east trailhead, and hiked in around noon. The heat was thick and heavy. I was sweating through my shirt within minutes. I had my pack loaded with everything: tent, food, water, stove, filter, knife, first aid kit, and even a printed map with compass as backup to my phone's GPS. I wasn't new to this. I'd hiked plenty of trails across the state and camped dozens of times, just never this far out and never this alone. But I was confident. By around 3:30 p.m., I found a decent spot, A small clearing near a dry creek bed. It was just far enough off the trail to feel hidden but open enough to avoid dense brush or snakes. I set up my tent under the shade of a couple of broad oak trees and started a small campfire using twigs and a lighter. I boiled water and made a packet of instant rice and beans. That first evening, everything felt calm. I laid back against my pack, watched the sunlight slip through the trees, and listened to the cicadas buzz like static in the air. After sunset, I climbed into the tent and zipped the fly shut. I could hear some rustling in the brush. Not unusual. Probably a possum or raccoon sniffing around. I had my food bag hung from a tree, well away from the tent. I didn't sleep much the first night, but I never do in a tent. The next day was more relaxing. I went for a slow walk deeper into the forest, trying to follow the faint trail I'd marked on my map. I spotted a few deer in the distance and heard the drumming of a woodpecker high up in the canopy. No cell service, no schedule, just stillness. I got back to camp around 2 in the afternoon and dozed off in the tent with the flap open. It was humid but quiet. Around dusk, I collected more firewood, made some coffee on the stove, and ate a protein bar. As night fell, the woods got louder with frogs and bugs, but I still felt comfortable. I'd grown used to those sounds. What changed was what I noticed that night before crawling into the tent. There were tracks, not animal but human, barefoot. They weren't there earlier. I know because I'd walked around that exact patch of dirt while collecting firewood. The footprints were fresh, maybe size 11 or 12, definitely bigger than mine. They came from the trees, passed a few feet from my tent, and then circled around the back before disappearing again into the woods. I just stared at them, heart starting to beat faster. My first thought was that maybe someone else was out here, another camper or hiker who got turned around. But no one hikes barefoot through thorns, rocks, and bugs this deep into the woods. And they didn't lead anywhere. They didn't connect to the trail. I stayed up late that night. I didn't start another fire. I turned off my headlamp and sat inside the tent, holding my knife. Every leaf that shifted in the wind made my ears twitch. My breathing got shallow. Around midnight, I thought I heard something move out in the woods, but I couldn't be sure. Could have been a deer, could have been anything, but the silence that followed felt thick and wrong. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found something else. My food bag was gone. I tied it up and hung it high, the same way I always do. Now it was just gone. The cord was still there, dangling from the branch, but the bag itself was missing. That shook me more than anything. Animals don't untie knots, and there were no claw marks, no ripped plastic. Someone had taken it. I checked around the clearing and found more footprints, this time with small bits of dried mud sticking to the grass. Whoever it was had come close to the tent again. Closer this time. There was even a small smudge on the side of the tent's nylon wall, just above where my head had been while I lay inside. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. I just threw everything into my bag, stomped out the fire ring, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I figured it would take me around 3 hours if I kept a steady pace. I moved fast, checking behind me every couple of minutes. My shirt was soaked through, but not from heat. I kept hearing sounds, snapping twigs, distant footfalls, but I couldn't see anyone. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Still, I kept going, pushing harder up the hills, brushing past branches, boots stomping down hard on the dry leaves. I just wanted to get back to the car. About halfway back, I found something off the trail. I almost missed it. A small pile of stones, stacked carefully on a flat stump. Just a weird arrangement of rocks, but they were shaped like a pyramid. Too precise to be random. There were feathers too, tucked between the cracks. Blackbird feathers, maybe crow. I stared at it for a while, then kept walking. I didn't take a picture. I didn't want any part of it. Not even a memory. The last stretch of trail twisted down through thick trees. The air smelled different there. Musty, like rot. I could see the sunlight hitting the gravel parking area through the trees, and I almost ran the last 100 yards. When I got to the car, I saw something that made my knees feel weak. A smear on the driver's side window, muddy, like someone had dragged their hand across the glass. But the car was locked. Nothing was broken, nothing stolen. Just that one long smear right at face level. I threw my pack into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I didn't even check my mirrors. I just turned the key and drove. I kept glancing at the rear view the whole way down the winding forest road. I didn't feel calm until I hit the main highway an hour later. Back in Cincinnati, I unpacked slowly. I kept thinking about those footprints, the missing food, the smudge on the tent, the stones, the feathers. Who had been out there with me? What did they want? I checked the local news over the next few days. Nothing reported. No missing persons, no hikers found, nothing unusual. It was like it never happened, but I knew it had. I could still feel the quiet tension of that forest pressing against my skin. A week later, I finally washed my gear. I opened my pack and emptied out the bottom pocket where I keep a backup lighter and trash bag. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. A folded leaf, tucked neatly beside the lighter. I hadn't put it there. It wasn't there when I packed. It wasn't from the campsite either. It was green and fresh, not brittle or dry. Inside the fold, there was a small splinter of wood, sharpened on one end, like a toothpick, but more pointed, like it had been carved. I threw it away, dumped the entire pack into a garbage bag, and left it in a dumpster 2 blocks from my apartment. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still love the woods, but never by myself. I never found out who was out there with me, or why they never spoke, or why they followed me. But I know what I saw, and I trust my instincts. Someone had been there watching. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person. And honestly, that's way worse. In the summer of 2019, I took a solo camping trip that I still think about more than I'd like to. I was 32 at the time, working as a freelance graphic designer out of Spokane. I had hit a slow patch in work and decided to take advantage of the lull. It was late July, just after a string of hot days, and I figured the timing was perfect for getting out into the woods to clear my head. I picked a remote area in northern Idaho called Hidden Ridge. It was about 3.5 hours from my place. The area wasn't well known, but I had found it months earlier while flipping through an old hiking blog. According to the write-up, there was a semi-cleared trail that led about 5 miles into the forest and ended near a small, quiet lake. There weren't any campgrounds, no cell reception, and no marked roads beyond a certain point. Exactly what I was looking for. I packed up my gear over the next 2 days and drove out on a Thursday morning. My car was an older Subaru Forester, nothing fancy, but it could handle the rougher roads. I had loaded it with a heavy-duty backpack, my tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, a camping stove, water filter, bear spray, and a first aid kit. I also brought a topographic map I'd printed out, a compass, and a small field notebook I like to use for sketching. The last hour of the drive was all gravel road, winding, narrow, and full of ruts. Trees pressed in close on both sides, and I didn't pass a single car the entire time. I parked at the end of what was basically a dirt shoulder and shouldered my pack. The air was dry and full of pine. The trailhead was barely visible, just a shallow indentation in the underbrush, but after pushing through some overgrown brush, the path became more defined. The first few miles were quiet and uneventful. I kept a steady pace and took breaks to drink water and check the map. The trail wasn't in great shape, but it was easy enough to follow. I saw some deer tracks and what I guessed were coyote prints. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I had left the rest of the world behind. That's what I wanted. It was around mid-afternoon when I reached the lake. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a football field and a half, with a narrow rocky shore on one side and dense woods on the other. The water was dark but still, and dragonflies zipped back and forth over the surface. I found a good spot slightly elevated from the lake, where the trees opened up just enough to let some light in but still offered cover. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, and got everything situated. I boiled water for one of my freeze-dried meals and sat by the water while it cooked. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees by the time I finished eating. I cleaned up, tied my food bag high in a tree away from the tent, and settled in. That first night, I slept decently. I woke up a few times to the sounds of movement in the woods, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But that was to be expected. Small animals, maybe deer, maybe raccoons. My brain would shoot up for a second, then settle down again when nothing happened. I had slept in the woods enough times not to let every sound get to me. The next morning was cool and quiet. I got up around 6, made coffee, and ate a granola bar while staring out at the lake. I spent the rest of the day hiking around the area, following game trails, taking photos and sketching. I found a small stream about half a mile from my camp, where the water was cold and clear. I filtered some into my bottle and washed my face. I didn't see another person or hear any planes overhead. Total isolation. That night, I went to bed feeling calm. It was around midnight when I woke up again. This time the noise wasn't small. It wasn't the crack of a single twig or the distant rustle of leaves. It was heavier, deliberate. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking near my tent. I stayed completely still. The sound wasn't close at first, just the occasional thud of weight pressing into the earth. It would stop, then pick up again. The rhythm was too spaced out to be a deer. It was slow, methodical. I laid there for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing, waiting for it to pass. But it didn't pass. It circled. I could hear it moving, the steps crunching on pine needles and dry leaves. It would shift from one side of my tent to the other, never fast, never running, just slow steps. I didn't hear sniffing or panting. No breathing, just footsteps and the occasional pause. I had my bear spray within reach, and I carefully slid my hand toward it. I didn't dare unzip the tent or turn on my flashlight. I was sure if I made noise, whatever it was would hear me. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the footsteps faded. I lay there for another hour before I finally fell back asleep. When I got up in the morning, everything looked normal. I checked the area around the tent, but didn't see anything unusual. No deep footprints or torn up earth. But that feeling of calm I had the day before was gone. Something had walked through my camp, and it hadn't been a curious animal. Not the way it moved. I should have packed up and left that morning, but I talked myself out of it. I told myself I was overthinking it. I had been alone too long, and my brain was inventing threats. I pushed it aside, made breakfast, and tried to enjoy the day, but I stuck close to camp. I didn't hike far. I kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I set up a small perimeter, tied some paracord with empty cans around the edge of my camp, hoping they'd make noise if anything moved through. I even slept with my boots on. Again, I was woken in the middle of the night. The cans rattled. Something had tripped them, but this time, instead of walking around the tent, it stopped completely. No movement, just stillness. I held my breath and listened. Then I heard the softest sound, fabric brushing against something, like clothing. That's when I knew this wasn't an animal. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I gripped the bear spray and waited for something to happen. Didn't. After what felt like an hour, I heard movement again, retreating this time. No crashing through the brush, just soft footsteps disappearing into the woods. When the sun came up, I got out of my tent and scanned the area. There were faint boot prints near where I had tied the cans. Too faint to follow, but they were there. They looked like hiking boots, adult-sized. I didn't have a doubt anymore. Someone was out there watching me, following me. This time, I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I shoved everything into my bag, tightened the straps, and started heading back down the trail. I kept checking behind me. Every broken branch or gust of wind made me flinch. About a mile in, I stopped for water and heard something behind me. Movement. Soft, but definitely there. I crouched low off the trail and waited. My mouth was dry. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Sticks breaking, steps shifting weight on uneven ground. Whoever it was, they weren't making much noise, but they weren't being careful either. They knew the area. That was the feeling I got. I stayed hidden for 20 minutes before moving again. Faster this time, no breaks. It was late afternoon when I reached my car. The moment I got in and locked the doors, I felt a little safer, but I didn't waste time. I started the engine and tore down that gravel road, trying not to go off into a ditch. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Back in Spokane, I kept replaying everything in my head. The footsteps, the quiet, the cans rattling. Someone had followed me 5 miles into the woods. They had circled my tent. They had waited, and I hadn't seen them once. I didn't report it. What would I have said? That someone walked around my tent in the middle of the night? That I found a few boot prints? It wouldn't have gone anywhere. But I did stop solo camping for a while. I sold a bunch of gear, gave away the tent, started sticking to populated campgrounds when I went out again. It's been a few years now, and I still don't know what that person wanted. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they were looking for something else. I'll never know. But I do know this. When you're 5 miles into the woods with no cell service and someone decides to follow you, there's not a damn thing stopping them. And that's what scared me the most. Not the footsteps, not the noise, but the silence, the calm, the way they didn't rush. They had time, and they knew I didn't. I was 32 that summer. It was late June 2021, and I had just moved from Baltimore to a small town in western North Carolina called Marion. I had taken a new job doing remote IT work for a private company out of New Jersey, and the freedom that came with it was still new to me. I'd been a city guy for most of my life, but I'd grown tired of it. Too much noise, too much stress, and too many people living on top of each other. So I sold my old place, packed up my stuff, and moved into a quiet rental house near the edge of Pisgah National Forest. For weeks I worked from my back porch, surrounded by green trees and fresh mountain air. It felt like I had finally found some peace. But after a while, I started to feel like I was wasting the location. I was living right next to one of the most beautiful forests in the country, and all I was doing was sitting at a desk all day, staring at a screen. I wanted to do something that would force me out into the wilderness. So I bought a decent backpack, a lightweight tent, a portable stove, and some supplies from a local outfitter. I planned a solo camping trip, just 2 nights, nothing crazy. Somewhere remote enough to be quiet, but not so far out that it would be dangerous. I settled on a spot near Curtis Creek. It wasn't an official campsite, but I'd found it marked on a few hiking forums. Apparently, it was a popular location with fly fishers and the occasional backpacker. No amenities, no cell service, no traffic, just forest. That sounded perfect to me. I left on a Friday morning early to beat the heat. The trail was narrow and winding, cutting through thick woods that felt completely untouched. The air smelled like wet bark and moss. After about 6 miles of hiking, I reached the creek, a wide, shallow stretch of water that curved around a bend and disappeared into thicker woods. I found a patch of dry, flat ground about 20 yards from the water and set up my tent there. The whole time, I didn't see another person. Not a single one. I spent the first afternoon relaxing, boiling some water for coffee, reading a book, and soaking my feet in the cold creek. It felt almost too peaceful. I remember thinking that I wished I'd done this sooner. I cooked a simple dinner, instant rice and some vacuum-packed chicken, and turned in when the sun dipped below the trees. The air cooled quickly, and the forest filled with the sounds of frogs and insects. I slept well that first night. Not perfectly, but well enough. The second day started normal. I had breakfast and decided to explore downstream a bit. I followed the creek for maybe half a mile, climbing over rocks and ducking under branches. I found an old log where someone had once sat and fished. There was a worn patch on the bark, and some faded fishing line tangled around a branch. I stayed there for a while, just enjoying the quiet. Around midday, I returned to camp and made some lunch. That's when I noticed something small but strange. My food bag was zipped closed, but it had been moved. It wasn't where I left it. I'd hung it low on a branch away from the tent, maybe 8 feet off the ground. Now it was on the ground under the tree. The bag wasn't torn or chewed, which made me think it wasn't an animal. A raccoon would have shredded it. A bear would have taken it. Everything inside was still there. It was just moved. I stood there staring at it for a long time. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't tied it well, and the wind had knocked it down. But it wasn't windy. I didn't hear anything fall. The branch it had been hanging from wasn't broken or bent. I picked it up and rehung it, this time double knotting the rope and pulling it even higher. I tried to shake the feeling off, but something about it stayed in the back of my mind. The rest of the afternoon felt tense. I kept glancing around at the trees, listening for footsteps or branches snapping. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I couldn't relax. I read a bit, paced around camp, and ended up going to bed earlier than usual, just to stop thinking. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up to little noises, twigs cracking, leaves rustling. But when I looked outside, it was just dark forest. No lights, no movement. At around 3 a.m., I finally fell into a deeper sleep. When I woke up, it was already bright out. I stepped outside to stretch, and that's when I noticed footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. Human. They were faint but clear enough in the soft dirt to see the toes. They came from the direction of the creek, circled the tent once, and disappeared into the trees behind it. No shoes, no gear, just a pair of bare feet that had walked silently around me while I was asleep. I froze. I remember feeling this cold wash over me, like my body suddenly understood something that my brain didn't want to believe. Someone had been in my camp. They had walked right up to me while I was sleeping, maybe even stood there watching me, and then just left. I didn't know what to do. I looked around the woods, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees, but there was nothing, no sound, just birds and insects like usual. I packed my stuff fast, stuffed everything into the backpack, didn't even bother with breakfast, and hit the trail back toward my car. The whole hike back felt like a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, stopping to listen. Once or twice I thought I heard something behind me, just small movements, maybe a squirrel or a deer, but it kept me on edge. I didn't rest. I didn't take off my pack. I just walked as fast as I could until I reached the car. When I finally got to the trailhead, I unlocked the car and threw everything inside. Then I stood there for a moment, looking back at the woods. I still hadn't seen a single person. Not one hiker, not one camper. And yet someone had definitely been out there with me. I drove straight home. When I got there, I checked all my gear. Nothing was missing, but something about that made it worse. If someone had stolen food or supplies, at least I could have made sense of it. But nothing was touched except the food bag being moved and the prints. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head. Who walks barefoot that deep into the woods? Why wouldn't they say something or make themselves known? Why circle the tent and then leave? A couple days later, I went back to the outfitter in town and talked to one of the employees there. An older guy with a beard who seemed to know the area well. I asked him if he'd ever camped near Curtis Creek. He said he had years ago, but that it wasn't a popular spot anymore. Then he said something that stuck with me. He told me that occasionally, folks had seen signs of squatters living deep off the trails, old shelters, strange markings on trees, that kind of thing. Not homeless exactly, just people who didn't want to be found. Off-the-grid types. Some of them were harmless. Others, not so much. That made sense in a way I didn't like. Maybe the person who crept through my camp wasn't trying to scare me. Maybe they lived out there. Maybe I got too close. I haven't been camping alone since. I still love the woods and I still go hiking sometimes, but I stick to marked trails. If I do camp, it's at a proper site with other people nearby. That one night changed how I see being alone out there. I used to think the forest was peaceful. Now I know it's just quiet, and that doesn't always mean safe. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, never figured out exactly who it was. But I believe someone watched me while I slept. They walked barefoot through the woods, circled my tent, and disappeared without a trace. I don't know what they wanted, maybe nothing, but I know I was lucky, because they could have done anything, and no one would have known until it was too late. It was August of 2019 when I decided I needed a break. I was 34 then, still working a tech support job in Sacramento, California. Life had started to blur into a loop of emails, phone calls, and weekends that passed like commercials. I wasn't sleeping well, barely touching my meals, and every time I sat at my desk, I felt this heavy pressure on my chest that I couldn't explain. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, just that constant low hum of anxiety that never shut off. I remembered a place I used to go camping at with my dad when I was younger, Tulie Lake, near the Oregon border. It was never too crowded, a bit off the main road, and had this long gravel path that led into a clearing beside the water. The spot had always felt isolated, but in a peaceful way. I figured a few days out there would help clear my head. Just me, the lake, and no screens. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, my small camping stove, a couple propane canisters, instant coffee, cans of beans, jerky, a basic first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a hatchet, and my old Smith & Wesson just in case I ran into wildlife. I'd brought a book too, something I hadn't done in years. I left early on a Thursday morning, hoping to avoid weekend traffic and get there with enough daylight to set up. The drive took about 6 hours. I stopped in Redding to top off the gas tank and grab a breakfast sandwich. Once I got off the main highway and onto the smaller roads, cell reception disappeared almost immediately. Felt like a sign to unplug. By the time I reached the gravel road that wound down toward Tulie Lake, my tires were kicking up dust, and my windows were down. It smelled like pine needles and hot dirt, and the wind made a low rushing sound through the trees. I felt better already. The campsite wasn't maintained by any park service. No fire pits, no bathrooms, just a narrow clearing next to the lake with enough flat space to pitch a tent. I parked the car where the grass started to get too high, took a few minutes to walk the area, then started unpacking. Setting up didn't take long. I got the tent staked down, unpacked my gear, and gathered some dry branches from the area around for a small fire later. I boiled some lake water with purification tablets just to be safe, then sat on a folding stool I'd brought and listened. The lake lapped quietly against the rocks. Birds chirped now and then. Somewhere off in the distance, I thought I heard a loon, though I couldn't be sure. It was quiet, but not silent. The kind of quiet that made you realize how much noise your everyday life really has. That first night went by without anything unusual. I made a simple dinner, read a couple chapters of the book, then crawled into my sleeping bag around 10. It got cold quickly once the sun dipped below the treeline. I lay awake for a while, listening to the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional splash from the water. I remember thinking how vulnerable I felt. Not scared exactly, but exposed. The only thing between me and everything else out there was a thin layer of fabric. I slept okay that night. Not great, not terrible. The next morning, I got up just after sunrise. The air was damp and smelled earthy. My breath came out in clouds as I boiled water for coffee. I sat for a long time by the edge of the lake, watching a mist roll across the water. I hadn't seen or heard a single person since I arrived, and the idea that I might be the only human within miles was oddly comforting. After breakfast, I hiked a bit. Nothing serious, just followed a deer trail up a hill and down the other side. I carried a small day pack with water, snacks, and the handgun, though I doubted I'd need it. I saw some squirrel tracks, maybe a fox's too, but no big game. I walked for about 2 hours before heading back to camp. That afternoon was more of the same, eating, reading, resting. I was starting to feel like myself again, like some kind of weight had been lifted just by being out there. I made a small fire as the sun went down and cooked a can of beans, then settled in for another early night. It was sometime around midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just snapped awake, like my body knew something I didn't. I lay still for a moment, eyes open in the dark, listening. The night was quiet, no wind, no bugs, no birds. That was the first thing that made me uneasy. Normally, the night was filled with sound, especially near water. But this was silence. Then I heard something. It came from outside the tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. A crunching sound, like dry twigs underfoot. One step, then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, straining to hear more. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. Just when I started to think I'd imagined it, I heard it again, this time closer. Another crunch, then 2 more. Slow, deliberate. Whatever it wasn't a deer. Deer don't move like that. They're fast, jerky. This was careful, steady. It sounded like footsteps. I eased my hand over to the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and flicked it on. The inside of the tent lit up in a soft yellow glow, and I felt slightly better. I sat up slowly and reached for the handgun. Another step, then another. Whoever or whatever it was maybe 10 feet from the tent now. I held my breath, waiting, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was thick. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I just sat there, holding the gun in my lap, flashlight pointed toward the fabric wall. A full 5 minutes passed. 10. Then, faintly, I heard it again. But this time it was moving away. Crunch, crunch, slowly fading into the distance. Then gone. I sat there for what felt like an hour before I finally lay back down. I didn't sleep again that night. Every little sound after that made me sit up, listening. But nothing else happened. The next morning, I stepped outside and did a slow circle around the tent. I didn't see anything obvious. No trash disturbed, no footprints. But the ground was dry and packed hard, so it was hard to tell. I walked further out, toward where I thought the sounds had come from. About 30 feet from the tent, I found a small piece of white fabric hanging off a branch, like it had been caught there. It looked like part of a shirt. Old, frayed. Could have been there for months or just last night. I thought about packing up right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been nothing. That third day, I didn't go far from the camp. I kept the handgun close and checked the area more thoroughly. Still no sign of anyone. By late afternoon, I was feeling a little better again. It was possible someone had been out hiking and got turned around in the dark. Or it was an animal. I didn't want to ruin the trip by jumping at shadows, but I kept a fire going that night, even after I climbed into the tent. I didn't want total darkness. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it again. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight and gun and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, so everything was dark except the moonlight. I stepped out slowly, trying not to make a sound. There was someone standing at the tree line. A man. He was maybe 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him motionless in the shadows. My stomach dropped. I raised the flashlight and aimed it at him. He turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. I didn't chase him. I stood there, shaking, gun in my hand, flashlight scanning the trees. But he was gone. That was it for me. At first light, I packed everything, shoved gear into the trunk, didn't even eat. I drove fast down that gravel road, heart still pounding the whole time. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I pulled over at a gas station in Klamath Falls and just sat there for a while. Back home, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe he was a hiker. Maybe he was lost. But he didn't call out, didn't approach. Just watched. Twice. And both times, he vanished without a word. I reported it to the local sheriff's office. More to clear my conscience than anything. They took the report but didn't seem too concerned. No missing persons. No known squatters. Nothing they could really do. A week later, I saw a post on a hiking forum. Someone had camped near Tulie Lake around the same time I was there. They heard footsteps too. Never saw anyone, but their food was taken from their cooler while they slept. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes I still think about that man standing in the dark, not moving, just watching. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up, or if I had stayed another night. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he wasn't. What I do know is this: no matter how peaceful the wilderness seems, you're never really alone out there. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't a bear or the weather. It's another person, hiding just out of sight, waiting. I went camping alone in late October of 2019, up near Lake Owen in the upper region of Vermont. I had just turned 30 a few months earlier and wanted a few days to myself before winter set in. I used to do this kind of thing a lot when I was younger, head off alone into the woods for 2 or 3 nights and just reset my mind. It always helped clear my head. That year, things were hectic at work. I had a new boss who didn't seem to like me, and my lease was coming up. I just needed a few quiet nights without any noise, without screens, and without people. Lake Oweneko isn't exactly a tourist destination. It's quiet, surrounded by rough dirt roads and old logging trails. There's a campground with about 10 primitive sites on the west side of the lake. But I didn't stay there. I parked at a gravel pull-off about 1.5 miles south of the lake and hiked in along an old trail I'd seen on a forestry map. It wasn't marked anymore, but it was still visible enough. I had my gear, my tent, a lightweight sleeping bag, a folding saw, some freeze-dried food, and a water filter. Nothing fancy. The forecast looked good, cool but dry. Took about 2 hours to find a spot that felt right. It was on a slight rise with some big rocks around and a view through the trees toward the water. I set up my tent just before dusk, got some water from the lake and filtered it, then ate a meal of rice and beans out of a pouch while the sun set. It got cold fast once it got dark. I built a small fire and sat there until the chill really started to creep in. It was quiet, completely silent except for the occasional creaking of the trees or rustle of a squirrel in the leaves. It was exactly what I wanted. That night I fell asleep quick, my body still tired from the hike in. I remember waking up once around midnight because I needed to pee, and the air outside the tent felt like it was just above freezing. I heard an owl off in the distance, and that was it. Nothing felt off yet. Everything felt normal. The next morning was the kind of morning that makes you feel alive. Cold air, blue sky, the smell of pine and moss. I walked to the lake and sat by the water for a while, just listening. Then I boiled water for coffee and had some oats. I spent most of the day hiking up and down the ridges to the west of the lake, looking for deer trails, interesting rocks, anything to pass the time. I found a patch of birch trees with long strips of bark peeling off like ribbon. I took some back to camp for fire starter. Later in the day, while I was gathering deadwood for the fire, I found something that made me stop. About 50 yards from my camp, deeper into the woods, I noticed a large tree with the bark stripped off in long vertical lines, like something had clawed at it. At first I figured it was a bear. I'd seen claw marks like that before, but there was no scat, no fur, nothing else. And the weird thing was the marks were low to the ground, like knee height, not shoulder height where a bear usually reaches. And they were wide apart, not deep scratches, just wide ones, and some of the wood had flaked off like it had been hit with something flat. I looked around for more signs but didn't see any. No tracks, no broken branches. I walked back to camp and tried not to think too much about it. It was probably just an animal, maybe even a person messing around. That evening I kept the fire going a little longer. The woods had started to feel different. Not threatening exactly, but like I wasn't completely alone out there. I didn't hear any animals. No squirrels, no birds, just wind and trees. It was the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. I went to bed around 10. My tent was zipped up tight, and I had my headlamp within reach. I left my boots just inside the tent and kept my knife under my pillow, which I always did out of habit. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. Not early morning dark, real middle of the night black. I hadn't heard anything at first. I just woke up suddenly, like something had triggered me, like my brain had flipped a switch. I laid still and listened. After a few seconds, I thought I heard a sound. It was soft, distant, like something brushing through dry leaves. I stayed frozen. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't constant, it came in short bursts like steps. It's hard to describe the kind of fear that hits you when you're alone in a tent and you hear something moving nearby. You can't see anything, and the thin nylon walls feel like they could tear open with a fingertip. I reached slowly for my headlamp and clicked it on. The light filled the tent and bled through the fabric in all directions. I couldn't hear the sound anymore. I waited for maybe 10 minutes, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I unzipped the tent a little and poked my head out. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, and everything was still. I scanned the area with my light. No movement. I got out, checked around, and didn't see any tracks or animals. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe not. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. About 20 feet from my tent, someone or something had placed a row of pine cones in a perfect straight line. There were 7 of them, all lined up, spaced evenly, all pointing the same direction. That hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. I looked around in every direction, trying to spot something. I called out a few times, even though I didn't expect an answer. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. They felt like a room someone else was already in. I packed my bag and moved my camp a quarter mile to a new spot. I knew I should have just left, but I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I was trying to be rational. Maybe some kid had messed with me. Maybe it was a ranger playing a prank, though that didn't make sense. But I didn't leave. I should have, but I didn't. The new spot was closer to a boulder field, with fewer trees and more visibility. I made a fresh fire ring, boiled water, and tried to settle in again. The day passed slow. I didn't see or hear anything. I avoided the spot with the marked tree and the pine cones. I didn't want to know more. That night, I kept my fire bigger. I stacked extra wood close to the ring and sat up later than usual. I must have dozed off by the fire because I woke up with my head leaning forward and my back stiff. The fire was low, mostly glowing coals, and the air was even colder than the night before. I stirred the coals and added a few pieces of wood, watching the flames flicker back to life. That's when I heard it. A sound behind me, maybe 30 feet off. It was slow. Not footsteps exactly, but something brushing against the trees, something soft. I turned fast with the light, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I waited a long time before going back to the tent. When I did, I placed a ring of branches and sticks around the perimeter so I'd hear if anything stepped on them. I zipped the tent up and kept my knife gripped in my hand, under the sleeping bag. Again, sometime around 3 or 4 a.m., I woke up. Not from a sound, but from the cold. I felt the air on my face and realized the tent was open. The zipper was down to the ground, and cold wind was blowing in. I sat up fast, light already in my hand. I looked out but saw no one. Nothing had been taken. Nothing moved. I don't know how the zipper got down. I'm not someone who forgets stuff like that, and even if I had left it partly open, it wouldn't have unzipped itself completely. I couldn't explain it. The first light, I broke down camp. My hands were shaking while I rolled up the tent. I didn't eat, didn't even drink water. I just packed and started walking back toward the car. I didn't take the trail I came in on. I followed the ridgeline and tried to stay up high, thinking I could move faster and avoid whatever had been around me. About halfway back, I saw another tree with marks on it. These were different, more like someone had bashed it with rocks. The bark was dented and cracked, and a few rocks were scattered nearby, with sharp edges and signs of impact. It looked intentional. I didn't stop long to study them. It took me 3 hours to reach the car. I kept stopping to listen, scanning behind me, trying not to make too much noise. I never saw anyone, never heard anything more than the wind. When I got to my car, I threw my pack into the back and drove straight out. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and had cell signal again. My hands hurt from gripping the wheel. My mouth was dry. I checked the back seat twice at the gas station like some paranoid idiot. I never went back to Lake Owen. I told a few friends about it, but I left out the weird details, the pine cones, the open tent. They just figured I got creeped out by being alone. But I know what I felt out there. I know how the woods changed around me. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be seen. But they wanted me to know they were close. They wanted me to feel them there. That wasn't an animal, and it wasn't some local kid playing games. It was someone who knew how to move in the woods, someone who watched from the trees without making a sound, someone who didn't leave footprints. Since then, I still hike, but I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go off trail, and I don't stay in the woods past dusk. There's nothing brave about ignoring your gut, and I was lucky to get out of there without anything worse happening. The line of pine cones, that's what sticks with me the most. That kind of detail means The year was 2012, early autumn in the northern woods of Vermont. I was 28, recently burnt out from my city job, craving solitude and a break from the noise of Boston. I had found a small cabin online, nestled deep in the Green Mountains, a place owned by a man who rarely came up. The pictures were old but promising. Rough-cut pine walls, a wood stove, no electricity, and just enough room for one person. The promise was peace, fresh air, and quiet, exactly what I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon, my car crunching over the gravel driveway that was more dirt than gravel. The forest was thick and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds. The sun was low, casting long shadows that made the trees look like tall, looming shapes. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. A single room with a loft, a tiny kitchen corner, and a small wood stove against the far wall. The place smelled like old pine and damp earth, mixed with the faint scent of something that felt like years of abandonment. I pulled the door closed behind me, the old latch creaking, and dropped my bag by the side of the stove. I started unpacking slowly, lighting a fire in the stove to chase away the chill. Outside, the wind picked up, making the tall trees sway. I heard a few dry branches snap under the weight of the breeze, but nothing more. I planned to spend the night here, then take some hikes and just be alone with the forest. But as the evening wore on, a strange unease settled in. It wasn't a feeling of ghosts or monsters, just something subtle, the kind that creeps up when you're truly isolated. I noticed small things first. The way the shadows outside seemed darker than they should be, the silence so thick it almost pressed against my ears. I tried to distract myself by unpacking a book and lighting a candle on the small wooden table. The flame flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows that made the cabin feel less empty. When night fell completely, I could hear the wind whistling through the trees louder, and the occasional thump of something hitting the cabin's roof. Probably just branches. But then there was another noise, a soft scraping, like fingernails dragged slowly over wood, coming from outside. I froze, listening. It stopped as suddenly as it started. I decided to ignore it. Maybe an animal, a raccoon or a deer brushing against the cabin. I didn't want to make myself paranoid. I slept lightly, waking now and then to the sounds of the forest at night. In the morning, I found small scratch marks on the outside of the cabin near the door, shallow but fresh. I took it as a sign that animals were nearby. Nothing more. The next day, I took my boots and backpack and headed out to explore the trails around the cabin. The woods were beautiful, bright leaves turning red and gold, the air crisp and clean. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift. When I returned, the cabin felt warmer, safer with daylight. But as I opened the door, I noticed something odd. My bag, which I had left by the stove, was now moved closer to the door. I was sure I hadn't moved it. I checked the rest of the cabin. Nothing else seemed disturbed. I shrugged it off. Maybe I had subconsciously moved it earlier without remembering. That night, the noises came again. Scratches at the door, soft thumps on the roof, sometimes a dragging sound on the side of the cabin. It was too heavy to be a small animal. It almost sounded like someone trying to get my attention, or worse, trying to get inside. I stayed awake for hours, clutching a heavy stick I found outside. The fire in the stove burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The sounds came and went, never constant, but always enough to keep my nerves on edge. Around midnight, the scraping noise came again, louder and longer. This time, I stood and moved quietly to the door, heart pounding in my chest. Peering out into the black night, I could barely see anything except the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting a small flashlight beam, about 30 feet from the cabin. The light moved slowly side to side, like someone searching. I stepped back, breath catching. I didn't call out, didn't make a sound. The eyes disappeared. I sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. Whoever it was, they weren't going to get inside easily. The cabin had a sturdy lock, and I had the stick. The next day, I considered leaving. I called the owner on the only spotty cell signal I could get at the edge of the clearing. No answer. I wanted to pack up and go back to the city, but something made me stay. Maybe pride or curiosity. I spent the day checking all the windows and locks, making sure everything was secure. I reinforced the door with extra wood I found outside. I made a list of possible escape routes and kept my backpack packed with essentials just in case. The third night was the worst. The noises didn't stop. This time I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, heavy boots on wet earth, scratches on the walls, the scraping sound that made my skin crawl. The flashlight beam returned, shining through the window, catching my eyes for a moment. I kept still, pretending I was asleep. The footsteps moved away slowly. Morning was a relief, but the cabin now felt like a trap. I decided to hike down to the nearest road, about 2 miles away, to find help. The trail was rough, but I knew the way well enough. As I packed, I noticed the front door was scratched deep in places, as if someone had tried to pry it open. That settled it. The hike down was tense. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the bushes made me stop and listen. The woods felt different, heavier, like eyes were watching. When I reached the road, I found a small gas station and bought a phone charger to boost my old phone's battery. I called the local police and reported the situation. They said they would send someone to check the cabin first thing in the morning. That night, I stayed in a motel nearby, safe under a lock and with people around. The next day, the police came back with me. We drove to the cabin. They searched the area and the inside of the cabin thoroughly. Outside, they found footprints, heavy boots, not animal tracks, circling the cabin multiple times. Inside, the locks had been tampered with, and there were signs someone had been watching for days. But there was no one there when they arrived. They told me this part of the woods was sometimes used by hunters and campers, but they suspected someone had been stalking the cabin, maybe watching for visitors to rob or worse. I was shaken but relieved. The police said they would patrol the area for a while. I decided not to go back to the cabin. It wasn't safe. Instead, I found another cabin farther away, in a more populated area, and spent the rest of my break there. In the end, I learned that sometimes the scariest things don't come from monsters or ghosts, but from other people. People who hide in the woods, watching quietly, waiting for their chance. And that kind of fear stays with you long after the woods go silent. I never thought a weekend alone in a remote cabin would turn into something I'd never forget. My name is Ethan. I was 28 at the time, and I had been craving a break from the constant noise and rush of city life. It was the summer of 2019, early August, and I decided to rent a cabin deep in the forest outside of Ashland, Oregon. The place was quiet, isolated, and perfect for the kind of solitude I was after. The cabin itself was a small wooden structure, maybe 700 square feet, built decades ago but still sturdy. It sat at the edge of a thick forest, surrounded by towering pine and fir trees. The property included a narrow dirt path that led down to a small lake, something I was told made the place special. I'd never been there before, and I was a little nervous driving that far from town on such a thin, winding road, but I kept telling myself I needed this. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday afternoon. The air was cool but smelled sweet, a mix of pine needles and damp earth. The sky was clear, and the sun was a bright orange ball sinking slowly behind the hills. As I pulled the car onto the gravel driveway, the only sound was the crunch of tires and the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. No other cabins were visible, no neighbors to bother me, just the forest and the lake waiting. The cabin door was unlocked, as the owner had promised, and inside was simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a stove and fridge, a living area with a sagging couch, a wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. The windows looked out into the forest, letting in golden light. I dropped my bags on the floor and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. After setting up my things, I decided to explore. I grabbed a small backpack, filled it with water, a flashlight, some snacks, and a basic first aid kit, then set off down the path to the lake. The trail was narrow and uneven, lined with thick roots and mossy stones, but easy enough to follow. Birds chirped quietly, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the low murmur of a creek. The air grew cooler under the thick canopy. When I reached the lake, it was still and quiet, almost like glass. The water reflected the blue sky and the tall trees all around it. I sat down on a flat rock at the edge, letting my feet dangle in the cool water. The peace was almost overwhelming. I stayed there for maybe an hour, watching a pair of ducks glide across the surface, then headed back as the light faded. That night, I made a fire in the wood stove and cooked some canned chili. The cabin felt cozy, the soft crackling of the fire mixing with the occasional creaks of the old wood settling. I opened a window slightly to let the fresh air in, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. I tried to read, but soon the quiet made me sleepy. I fell asleep quickly. The second day began with a pale dawn. I woke early, eager to explore more of the forest. I packed a small lunch, dressed in sturdy boots and a jacket, and started walking along a different path that branched off from the cabin's driveway. The forest here was dense, trees close together, their trunks thick and darkened by moss. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in pale green shafts. I walked for miles, careful to mark my path mentally. The terrain was uneven, with fallen branches and rocks covered in soft moss. The sounds of birds and small animals filled the air, but I noticed something odd. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Not the silence of nature, but a heavier silence, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and pressed on. After a while, I came across an old dirt road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was covered in grass and weeds, and the trees were slowly reclaiming it. I followed the road, thinking it might lead back to the cabin or at least to a landmark. About 30 minutes in, I noticed some strange tire tracks on the dirt, fresh, maybe from the last few days. That made me uneasy. No one had mentioned any neighbors or other visitors in this area. I kept walking, and soon I heard something. Not a sound exactly, but a faint rustling, like footsteps moving quickly but carefully behind the trees. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or a squirrel. Still, I turned around and looked back several times, but saw nothing. When I finally decided to head back, the sky had turned gray, and thick clouds rolled in, blotting out the sun. The forest looked darker now, the shadows sharper, quickened my pace. The forest path was trickier in the dim light. Suddenly, I felt that same rustling again, closer this time. I froze, holding my breath. There was a snapping of twigs. Then a branch cracked not far from me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but saw only empty darkness between the trees. I told myself to calm down. Probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the feeling of being watched clung to me. By the time I reached the cabin, the rain had started. I was soaked by the time I got inside, locking the door behind me. I checked all the windows and drew the curtains. The cabin felt smaller now, less safe. I made a quick meal and sat near the wood stove, trying to focus on the fire and the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. As night fell, the storm grew stronger. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin's old wooden walls. Every creak and groan seemed louder, more threatening. I kept my flashlight beside me, ready in case I needed to check outside. Around midnight, I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping on the cabin door. I froze. The sound came again, steady and slow, like someone knocking. I stared at the door, the hairs on my arms standing up. My mind raced through possibilities, a lost hiker, an animal, or something worse. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The tapping stopped, then after a long pause, started again, louder and more insistent. I grabbed a heavy metal lamp from the table and crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. When I reached it, I looked through the peephole but saw nothing but darkness and rain. The tapping stopped again. I waited, listening to the storm. Nothing else came. I locked the door extra tight and moved away. The rest of the night was tense, every little noise making me jump. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun peeked through the trees, bright and warm. I stepped outside and saw muddy footprints around the cabin, fresh but indistinct. Someone had been near my door during the night, but I found no other sign of them. No tracks leading away clearly, just the footprints circling the cabin as if the person had been hiding. I spent the day checking my phone, hoping for a signal to call for help if needed, but there was none. The forest seemed peaceful again, but I felt different. I packed extra supplies, prepared for an early departure. But when I tried to start my car, the battery was dead. I hadn't noticed before because the keys had been in the ignition and the lights were off, but now the car was completely unresponsive. I felt trapped. The nearest town was a good 30-minute drive, and the weather forecast warned of another storm arriving by evening. I had no way to contact anyone, no way to leave quickly. That afternoon, I decided to stay alert, keep my eyes open for any signs of whoever had been around the cabin. I patrolled the perimeter several times, each time noticing more of those footprints, as if someone was watching, circling but never approaching directly. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. I couldn't shake the fear, but I forced myself to stay calm, rational. I remembered the first aid kit and decided to collect some kindling and dry wood from the forest to keep a fire going. The sun was still warm, but the nights would get cold fast. While gathering wood, I noticed something strange. A crude shelter made of branches and leaves a short distance from the cabin. It looked fresh, barely hidden. My heart sank. Someone had been living close by, watching me for days, maybe longer. I didn't want to go near it, but I had to know. I approached cautiously, finding a small pile of discarded cans and a torn blanket inside. No sign of a person, but it confirmed my fear. Someone was out here, hiding in the woods. I returned to the cabin, locking the doors and windows as securely as I could. That night, I barely slept, listening for any sounds. Around 3 a.m., I heard soft footsteps on the porch, the sound of someone moving quietly. I grabbed the lamp and waited, but the footsteps stopped before the door. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but resolved. I had to leave. I spent the morning trying to jumpstart my car with the help of a small portable charger I luckily had in my backpack. After a frustrating couple of hours, the engine finally roared to life. Relief flooded me like a wave. I packed quickly, checked the cabin one last time, and locked the door behind me. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, dark and silent once again. On the way back to town, I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. They took the report seriously. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a week off and escape the city life for a while. I was 27 then, living in Portland, Oregon, and feeling burnt out from the constant noise, crowded streets, and endless work hours. I needed silence, nature, something to reset my mind. I found an old cabin for rent deep in the Cascades, about 2 hours east of the city, near a little town called Eagle Creek. The owner described it as rustic but cozy, and the pictures showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by thick pines and rolling hills. Sounded perfect. I packed my bags carefully, bringing only the essentials: warm clothes, canned food, water, a small camping stove, a flashlight, matches, a book, and a first aid kit. No phone signal was guaranteed, but I liked that. I wanted to disappear for a few days. The drive was beautiful. The highway narrowed. The air grew colder and fresher. Soon I turned off the main road onto a gravel path, the tires crunching on loose stones. The trees got taller and denser, the shadows longer as the sun dropped behind the hills. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly as described. Weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney with no smoke, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs. No neighbors in sight, just the forest stretching in every direction. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dry pine needles, a hint of mustiness from sitting empty most of the year. The inside was small, maybe 400 square feet. A narrow kitchen counter with a rusty sink, a cast iron stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and in the back, a tiny bedroom with a creaky bed. There was no electricity except for a few old-fashioned oil lamps and a propane heater in the corner. The windows were thick with grime, but still let in soft, filtered light. The first night, I made a fire in the stove, lit an oil lamp, and cooked some beans over the stove. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the trees whispered with the breeze. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I settled into bed early, feeling a strange calm I hadn't known for a long time. The second day, I decided to explore the nearby trails. I packed some water and a map the owner had left on the kitchen table, grabbed my flashlight and a pocket knife and headed out. The forest was alive with autumn colors, reds, oranges, and yellows blending with the deep greens of firs and pines. The air was crisp, every breath sharp and clean. I followed a trail uphill that led to a ridge with a view of the valley below. From there, I could see the distant town, tiny houses clustered together, and the river winding like a silver snake through the trees. I sat on a rock and rested, feeling the sun warm my back. As I walked back, I noticed something odd. On the side of the trail, a small patch of ground looked disturbed, as if someone had dug into the dirt recently. The soil was loose, and a few sticks lay scattered nearby, broken as if a small tree branch had snapped off. I frowned but thought nothing of it. Maybe an animal had been digging for roots or food. That night, as I sat by the stove reading, I heard a faint rustling outside the window. The wind was calm, so it wasn't the usual creaking of the trees. I stood and looked out, but the darkness swallowed the forest. My flashlight's beam swept over the yard, but there was nothing there, only the silhouettes of the pines swaying gently. The third day, I woke early to the sound of heavy footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some wild animal, but the rhythm was slow and heavy, deliberate. I got dressed quietly and looked out the window. There was nothing visible except the thick fog rolling over the ground, muffling everything. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the day inside, fixing the latch on the back door and cleaning the fireplace. When evening came, the wind had picked up again, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the night. I made an early dinner and went to bed, but sleep was uneasy. At about 2 in the morning, I woke to a sharp noise, a loud thud on the side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, shining it into the blackness. There was a pile of leaves and branches, freshly thrown against the glass. My breath came fast. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening. The forest was alive with sounds. Distant howls, the rustling of leaves, twigs snapping underfoot. Every so often, I thought I heard voices low and muffled, but when I strained to listen, there was only silence. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but a knot of fear tightened in my stomach. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin for a while and head into Eagle Creek to get some supplies. I packed my backpack quickly and locked the door behind me, the feeling of being watched heavy on my mind. On the trail, I noticed more signs. Footprints in the mud near the cabin, broken branches snapped low, and strange marks scratched into the bark of a tree. They looked recent and not like animal tracks. I slowed down, glancing behind me often, but saw no one. When I reached the town, I went to the small grocery store and bought canned food, fresh water, batteries, and a simple phone with a cord to call out if needed. The cashier was an older man who gave me a wary look but said nothing. I paid and left quickly, eager to get back to the cabin. Back at the cabin, the feeling of unease was stronger. The front porch steps had fresh dirt on them, and a small pile of rocks had been stacked next to the door. I checked the windows. Some had smudges and dirt smeared across them, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass. I sat down on the porch and thought about what to do. I was alone, miles from the nearest help, and someone or something had been close enough to touch my cabin. The idea of being watched was no longer just a feeling. It was a fact. The fourth day was restless. I didn't leave the cabin. I reinforced the locks with a metal rod I found in the shed behind the cabin. I gathered stones from the yard to place in a line around the cabin's perimeter, thinking it might make a barrier, even if only a psychological one. I kept the flashlight close and the door locked at all times. That evening, as darkness fell, the noises outside increased. Branches scraped against the walls, soft footsteps circled the cabin, and faint breathing sounded through the trees. My heart raced and I felt frozen in place. Suddenly, a loud banging on the door startled me. It was heavy, repeated, urgent. I pressed myself against the wall opposite the door, clutching the flashlight and the rod. The banging stopped, Silence returned. Minutes later, I heard something move toward the back of the cabin. I didn't dare look, but I heard the door to the shed creak open and close softly. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Someone looking for shelter, a lost hunter, or something worse. I decided I couldn't stay inside all day and night, but leaving the cabin felt dangerous. So I planned to leave at first light the next morning. The fifth day was cold and gray. I packed my bag with essentials and double-checked the locks. As dawn broke, I stepped outside, and the forest was eerily silent. No birds sang, no animals rustled. The air felt heavy. I walked briskly to the car, glancing back often. Nothing moved. As I drove down the gravel road, I felt relief wash over me. The cabin disappeared behind a wall of trees, and soon I was back on the highway. I didn't stop until I reached a small diner in a town further down, where I sat for hours trying to process everything. Days passed. I contacted the cabin owner and told him I wouldn't be coming back. I asked if anyone else had been there recently, or if the cabin had any history. He said it had been empty for years until he started renting it out, and no one else had reported problems. But the signs were clear. Someone had been there before me, watching, waiting. I never found out who or why. The experience stayed with me for years. I never went back to that cabin or to the forest around Eagle Creek. I kept my trips to nature in busier, more populated areas after that, where I could at least feel safe knowing I wasn't alone or being watched. That week in the cabin taught me something important about being alone in the wilderness. Not every danger is wild animals or the weather. Sometimes, it's the unknown people lurking just beyond the trees, silent and patient, waiting for the right moment. And that is a kind of fear that never leaves you long after you've left the forest behind. I never liked the idea of going alone into the woods, especially in the late fall, when the days grow short and the nights feel endless. But I needed a break. The city had drained me dry. The noise, the endless rush, the crowd pushing in from all sides. I wanted quiet. I wanted something raw and real. That's why I found the cabin on the outskirts of the Cascades, near a little-known trail called Ridgeview Pass. It was a small wooden place, old but sturdy, sitting on the edge of a clearing surrounded by tall, dark pines. The owner had assured me it was perfect for a solo getaway. No one around for miles, no distractions, just the wind, the trees, and me. I arrived in October of 2018. The air was crisp, smelling like pine needles and damp earth. The sun was already low when I parked my old sedan at the trailhead. The path to the cabin was rough, a narrow dirt road scarred by rain and roots, winding through thick forest. My backpack was heavy, loaded with food, water, blankets, and enough firewood to last a week. The silence wrapped around me like a thick blanket, unsettling and deep. Every step I took on the leaf-strewn path felt amplified. Crunch, crack, snap, until I finally saw the cabin through the trees. The cabin looked smaller up close. It was a simple structure, made of weathered logs, with a small porch and a metal roof showing patches of rust. The windows were dirty but intact, reflecting the dimming sky. I pushed open the door and was greeted by the smell of old wood and faint smoke from the last visitor's fire. Inside, the cabin was modest but comfortable. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sagging couch and a wooden table sat near it. There was a tiny kitchen with a rusty sink and a gas stove, and a narrow bed tucked into a corner. I set my things down and started a fire. The wood crackled and spit, sending warmth and flickering light through the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, making them sway and groan. I spent the first evening preparing a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, eating slowly as the fire burned low. I wanted to relax, but there was something about the place that made me uneasy. Not because of the cabin itself, but the overwhelming silence. No birds, no insects, no animals, just the wind and the dark. That night, I slept poorly. The bed was hard, and every little noise outside, an animal stepping on dry leaves, a branch scraping the roof, woke me up. I tried to tell myself it was normal. The woods were alive in their own way, even if quiet now. But just before dawn, I heard something different. It was faint but sharp, a soft thud near the back of the cabin, like something heavy falling to the ground. My heart beat faster. I stayed still, eyes wide, listening. The wind had stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, thick and heavy. Then the sound again, another thud, closer this time. I didn't move. I wasn't ready to face whatever was out there, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. When morning came, I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, stepping carefully into the cool morning air. The clearing looked peaceful, bathed in the pale light of dawn. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I walked around the cabin, eyes searching the ground. Then I saw it, scattered pieces of something dark and heavy. Branches snapped, and broken leaves lay scattered, like signs of a struggle. I followed the trail of broken branches and crushed leaves toward the edge of the clearing. The footprints were faint, but they're deep, wide, and uneven. They looked like someone's, but much bigger than mine, and the shape was odd, almost like a boot with an irregular sole. The prints disappeared into the trees. I hesitated, then decided to go back to the cabin to gather my things. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Over the next 2 days, I tried to focus on the usual: gathering firewood, fixing a leaking tap, cooking simple meals. But every time I stepped outside, I noticed signs of someone else's presence. Fresh footprints appeared around the cabin, sometimes close to the windows. One evening, I found the porch chair overturned, and a scrap of cloth caught on a nail. The cloth was thick and coarse, like from a jacket. I had no idea how anyone could have gotten here without me hearing them, but it was clear I wasn't alone. The isolation began to wear on me. The quiet turned sinister. The forest, which had seemed so inviting, now felt like a trap. I stopped going into the woods beyond the clearing. At night, I kept the fire blazing, checking the locks on the doors repeatedly. I avoided looking out the windows after dark, afraid of what I might see. The footprints came and went. Once, I found a line of them circling the cabin, as if someone had walked all the way around in the dark. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The nearest town was miles away. I was trapped by distance and nature. The feeling of being hunted or watched became unbearable. I stayed awake for long hours, listening to every sound. The woods seemed full of eyes. Sometimes, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows shifting behind trees, a shape just beyond the edge of the clearing. But when I looked directly, nothing was there. On the fourth night, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, stuffing my clothes and supplies into my backpack. I left the fire burning low and unlocked the door. I moved silently, trying not to make a sound. As I stepped outside, I froze. There was a figure standing near the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, motionless. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't dare run or call out. The figure didn't move or speak. After what felt like minutes, it turned and vanished into the forest. I ran back inside and locked the door, my hands trembling. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the windows. When the first light came, I stepped outside. The figure was gone, but the signs remained. The footprints led deeper into the woods. I knew I had to leave before dark. I hurried to the car, backpack strapped tight. The walk back along the trail was tense. Every crack of a twig made me jump. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see the figure again. But the forest was quiet. I reached the car and locked the doors, sitting inside to catch my breath. That day, as I drove away from the cabin, the sun was high, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I told myself it was probably some hunter or someone living rough in the forest, curious or cautious. Still, I never wanted to return. Weeks later, I called the cabin owner to cancel the rest of my stay and explain why I left early. He told me something strange. The previous renter had also left suddenly, saying they felt watched. No one else had rented it since then. He admitted that sometimes people came into the forest illegally, maybe squatters or hunters, and that the area was remote and hard to police. I realized then that my fear had a cause rooted in reality. No ghosts or monsters, just people, strangers, hidden in the woods, possibly watching me for reasons I didn't understand. The thought was chilling. What if they had been closer than I ever knew? What if I had been lucky? The cabin remained on the rental list, but I never went back. The experience taught me that the wilderness isn't always peaceful. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you imagine, but what you can't see, waiting in the shadows. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city and spend a week alone in the woods. I was 28 then, working a job that had me sitting in front of a screen for most of the day. I felt trapped in a cycle. Wake, work, sleep, repeat. And I knew I needed space, quiet, and time to think without interruptions. So, I rented a small cabin far from town in northern Vermont, near a place called Lost River State Forest. The cabin was nothing fancy. A single room with a tiny kitchen nook, a wood stove in the corner, a bed pushed against one wall, and a small bathroom. It sat at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick pine and birch trees that rustled even in the faintest breeze. The gravel road to get there was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for one car, with branches scraping the sides as I drove deeper into the woods. The air smelled crisp and clean, filled with the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. I arrived just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The cabin sat quiet, almost hidden in the shadow of the tall trees. As I unpacked, I could hear the distant call of a barred owl and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. My plan was simple. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the forest. That first night was calm, almost peaceful. I built a small fire in the stove, heated up some canned soup, and lay on the bed reading a battered paperback I had brought along. Outside, the woods felt alive, but not in a threatening way, more like they were just watching. I told myself I was safe, that the forest was just trees and animals. The next morning, I woke early to the soft light filtering through the curtains. The silence was different in daylight, less intimidating but still heavy. I prepared a simple breakfast, then pulled on my boots to explore the area around the cabin. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and pine needles. I could see tracks, deer, maybe a fox, crisscrossing near a small creek not far from the cabin. The creek water was clear and cold. I filled a bottle and drank slowly, enjoying the cool freshness. The trees were tall and straight, with branches that swayed softly. The sunlight made patterns on the ground like a mosaic. I walked for a few hours, taking pictures with a disposable camera I'd brought, mostly of the changing leaves and the little details. A patch of moss, an old tree stump, a bird's nest high in the branches. It felt good to be away from everything, just observing nature in its quiet beauty. That evening, I built another fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal. As the night deepened, the sounds changed. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere nearby, a pack of coyotes howled. The noises felt raw and wild, reminders that I was a stranger here. On the third day, things began to feel off. I'd gone out early to explore a trail I had spotted from the cabin window. It was narrower and less traveled, winding through a thick section of forest. After about an hour of walking, I noticed the trail splitting, and at the fork was something I hadn't expected. A small campsite, not abandoned. There were fresh footprints in the dirt and a fire pit with cold ashes, but no sign of recent use. Nearby, I found an empty water bottle, a torn piece of a plastic bag caught in a bush, and a flattened cardboard box that looked like it had been used to sleep on. My heart beat faster. I hadn't expected to find signs of other people so close. The area felt strangely quiet, too quiet, like the forest had been holding its breath. I looked around carefully, but there was no one in sight. I decided to head back to the cabin, my mind racing with questions. Who had been here? Were they still nearby? I told myself to stay calm. It was a public forest. People camped all the time, probably just hikers passing through. That night, I locked the cabin door and double-checked the windows before going to bed. Even then, I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't say if it was real or just my imagination. The forest sounds seemed louder, more urgent. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. A sharp noise had pulled me from sleep. something like a twig snapping outside the window closest to the bed. I froze, listening hard. The wind had stopped, and so had the usual chorus of night creatures. There was only silence. I got up quietly and peered out the window. Moonlight spilled onto the clearing, illuminating the trees' twisted shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping between the trunks. But when I blinked, it was gone. My heart hammered, but I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal. Still, sleep didn't come easily after that. I stayed awake, listening until dawn. The next morning, I found something disturbing just outside the cabin door. In the dirt, clear as day, were footprints, not animal but human. Barefoot, they looked fresh. They started at the edge of the woods and ended right at my doorstep. No footprints leading away. Cold feeling crept over me. I checked the locks again, but there was no sign anyone had tried to force the door. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed moved. Still, I packed some essentials into my backpack: water, food, my small knife, and a flashlight, and decided to explore the area further, hoping to find some clue or explanation. As I walked around the perimeter of the clearing, I noticed other signs. Marks on tree bark, as if someone had used a knife to scratch symbols or letters into the wood. The markings were crude but deliberate, like a message or a warning. The deeper I went, the thicker the forest became. The air grew colder and damper, and the light dimmed under the heavy canopy. I kept hearing faint sounds behind me, branches breaking, leaves crunching, but every time I turned, there was nothing. I found the campsite again. This time it was different. The fire pit held a few scattered ashes, still warm. There was a small backpack left by a tree, and inside I found a nearly empty water bottle and a tattered map. The map was old and hand-drawn, showing the general area but with strange marks and notes in the margins. I didn't recognize the writing. It was messy, jagged, and mostly illegible. But one word was clear: stay. That was when I felt the full weight of being watched. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight through the underbrush, but the beam caught only trees and shadows. No people, no animals. I hurried back to the cabin, my breath coming fast and shallow. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, stepping carefully on the gravel. The sound made my skin crawl. I stayed frozen on the bed, listening to the footsteps pause, then move again, sometimes stopping at the windows, sometimes by the door. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's old wooden walls. I wanted to call for help, but I had no signal. My cell phone showed no service, the same as it had the entire time. Hours passed. The footsteps eventually stopped. The forest went silent again. When the first light crept over the horizon, I threw on my clothes and left the cabin. I walked as fast as I could down the gravel road toward the main highway. Every noise, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I didn't look back. It took nearly 2 hours, but I finally reached a small town where I could call for a ride. Once safe inside a diner, warm and crowded with people, I called the local ranger station. I reported the footprints, the campsite, the strange marks on the trees, and the footsteps outside my cabin. The ranger listened carefully and said they would send someone out to check the area. When I returned the next day with the ranger, the forest looked peaceful, almost normal. They walked me around the site. The footprints were gone, the campsite wiped clean. The marks on the trees were just old scars from hunters marking territory. The ranger explained that Lost River State Forest was known for occasional trespassers, some with bad intentions, homeless people, vandals, or worse. They suspected someone had been camping illegally nearby and possibly watching the cabin but had left before they arrived. Relief mixed with lingering unease settled over me. I packed my things and left the cabin for good that day. Driving away, I looked back once. The forest was still, the cabin a small speck swallowed by the trees. I never went back. In the end, I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the presence of another person who wants to stay hidden, watching and waiting. Being alone in the woods means you're vulnerable, not just to nature, but to those who might see you as a target or a curiosity. That week changed me. I learned how quickly fear can grow in silence, how your mind can twist shadows into threats, but also how real danger sometimes hides in plain sight. The forest was not haunted by spirits. It was just a place where people lived, struggled, and sometimes crossed paths in ways you didn't expect. That truth stayed with me long after I returned to the city. I still hear the echo of those footsteps sometimes, soft, slow, and near, reminders that even when you think you are alone, you might not be. It was October 1987 when I first decided to spend a week alone in the woods, in a cabin I had rented near a small lake in northern Vermont. I was 28 years old, and after months of working long hours in the city, I craved silence and a break from people. The cabin was tucked away about 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The owner, an older man named Carl, said it was the perfect place to get away from everything. He promised it was isolated but safe. When I arrived late on a cold fall afternoon, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. The small dirt road to the cabin was rough and narrow, winding through towering pines and maple trees with leaves just starting to turn fiery reds and golds. The cabin itself was a modest wooden building, maybe 600 square feet, with a stone chimney on one side and a front porch with 2 rocking chairs. The wood smelled faintly of pine and old smoke, like it had sat there for decades without much use. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a sink with a hand pump for water, a table, and a couple of chairs. There was a narrow staircase leading to a loft with a thin mattress and wool blankets. A small woodpile was stacked neatly outside the back door. I'd brought a few books, some canned food, a lantern, and enough firewood to last the week. No phone, no radio, just me and the woods. The first night was quiet except for the sounds of wind moving through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. The cabin felt safe then, like a warm shell against the cold dark outside. I had a fire going in the stove, and I sat close to it, reading by lantern light until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I slept well, wrapped in the blankets, feeling miles away from city noise and the pressure of work. The next few days passed slowly but peacefully. I woke with the sun and made coffee on the stove. I took long walks around the lake and through the forest, watching squirrels gather nuts and birds fly from branch to branch. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and wet leaves. I noticed how quiet the woods were. No distant cars, no planes overhead, just the natural sounds of the forest. One afternoon, about 4 days into my stay, I was chopping wood outside the cabin when I heard something unusual. A faint, sharp snapping noise, like a branch breaking, but it was close, maybe just a few hundred feet away. I paused, looking into the trees. The woods were thick, and the shadows were deep under the canopy. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. I tried not to think too much about the noise I'd heard. Sometimes being alone in the woods makes your mind play tricks on you. The next morning, the sky was a pale blue, and the wind had died down. I decided to explore further, to the east side of the lake, a part one hadn't yet seen. The ground was damp, covered with fallen leaves and small stones. I walked slowly, enjoying the quiet. About a mile from the cabin, I noticed something odd on the forest floor. A patch where the leaves were disturbed, pressed down unevenly as if someone had been there recently. The ground was soft, and I could see footprints. They were too big and deep to be from any animal I knew, maybe the size of a man's boot. I looked around, but the forest was empty, just the wind and the distant call of birds. I figured maybe some hunters or hikers had passed by in the last day or two. Nothing to worry about. That evening, I cooked a simple meal and settled near the fire. Then I heard it again, that snapping noise, much closer this time. It wasn't far away, maybe just outside the cabin. I grabbed the old hunting knife I had brought and crept to the window. The moon was low and bright, casting long shadows through the trees. I saw movement just beyond the porch. A figure, crouched low near the woodpile. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the night. I froze, heart pounding. He didn't seem to notice me watching. After a moment, he stood up and slipped silently into the woods. I watched until he disappeared between the trees. I locked the door and closed the shutters. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was just a hunter or a woodsman passing through, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. When I went outside, I found more signs. The woodpile had been disturbed. Some pieces moved and a few small marks carved into the wood. They looked like scratches, but I couldn't tell what they meant. I didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the day. I kept the fire burning and sat near the door, knife close by. The forest was quiet, but every sound felt amplified. The rustling of leaves, a bird's cry, even the wind. On the fifth night, it rained hard. The storm rattled the cabin and made the dirt road to the cabin muddy and slick. I listened to the rain beating on the roof and hoped the figure wouldn't come back in this weather. The woods were dark and wet, and I was alone. Around midnight, a sharp noise woke me. It wasn't the rain. It sounded like someone trying to open the back door. My heart leapt. I grabbed the knife and crept out of bed. The cabin was cold, and the rain had leaked in near the windows. The back door handle was wet, and there were muddy footprints outside on the porch. They led off into the woods. I called the local sheriff on the one phone call I was allowed, but it was a pay phone at the gas station, 15 miles away. I drove there the next morning through muddy roads and explained the situation. The sheriff was calm but promised to check the area. That afternoon, 2 deputies arrived and searched the woods around the cabin. They found a campsite about a mile away, a small fire pit, and evidence someone had been staying hidden in the forest. Empty cans, a sleeping bag, and some tools were there. The deputies warned me to be careful and said they would patrol the area for a few days. After that, I stayed locked inside the cabin, only going out during the day and always with a knife or a big stick. The woods felt different, hostile, like the peaceful quiet was gone. On the 7th day, just before I was due to leave, I woke to find the front porch door wide open. Nothing was stolen, but I knew someone had been there. I packed quickly and didn't look back. Driving away on the muddy road, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The forest was beautiful, but hiding dangers I hadn't imagined. Looking back, I realized the woods are not just quiet and peaceful places. People can be out there too, watching and waiting. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but just other humans with unknown reasons and dark intentions. I never saw the man again, but I always wonder who he was and what he wanted. The cabin rental stopped after that. I haven't been back to the woods alone since. I don't usually like to come out here, not alone. The woods around that old cabin are dense and quiet in a way that gets under your skin. This place is miles away from the nearest town, tucked deep in the forest of northern Vermont. The year was 1993. I was 29 then, and the city life was wearing me down. Too loud, too fast. I needed a break, something simple. I found the cabin in an old real estate ad, neglected but standing strong, owned by a man who no longer came up from the city. The photos showed a tiny wood cabin, a few acres of trees, a creek nearby, just what I thought I needed. The drive there was long and bumpy. The last few miles were on a gravel road barely wide enough for one car. I remember the car shaking and rattling as I went slowly, the sun already low in the sky. The trees around me grew taller and thicker with every mile, their branches scratching at the car windows. When I finally saw the cabin, it was just as the ad promised. Small, made of rough pine logs, with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged a little on one side. It was set back from the road, with tall pine trees all around, and the creek running just 100 feet behind it. I parked, grabbed my bags, and stepped out. The air was crisp, smelling like pine needles and wet earth. I carried my things up the steps, the wood creaking beneath my boots. The door was unlocked, but stiff. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. There were some basic furnishings: a rickety table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a thin mattress, and a small wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I spent the first evening cleaning and setting things up. I found some dry wood stacked under the porch and got a fire going in the stove. The warm glow filled the cabin, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. The second day, I went out to explore. The forest was thick, full of towering pines and maples. The creek was clear and cold, the sound of running water soothing. I followed it upstream for a while, finding some spots where the water pooled into small clear pools. There were wildflowers and birds, and the occasional deer tracks in the mud. The sun was bright through the leaves, making the forest floor look like a patchwork of light and shadow. That night, I felt calm and tired. I made a simple meal on a small camping stove I'd brought, then sat by the fire until it died down. I lay on the mattress, listening to the forest outside. The wind whispered through the trees, the leaves rustling softly. I thought about how peaceful it was. No cars, no people, just the woods and me. But on the third night, things began to change. I was waking up around midnight, my heart beating faster than usual. First, I thought it was just the wind. The cabin groaned as the breeze shifted, branches tapping against the roof. But then I heard a sound that didn't fit. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves outside, slow and deliberate. I stayed still, staring at the dark window. The moon was just a sliver, so the woods outside were mostly shadows. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the clearing, right where the porch began. My mind tried to explain it away, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But the steps were too heavy, too even for an animal. I wanted to get up, to check the door, but I was frozen. I told myself it was nothing, but my hands trembled. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving slowly away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn came, I forced myself outside. The ground was damp with dew, but I saw something new: footprints. Human footprints. Big ones. They led from the edge of the trees to the porch steps and then back the way they came. I looked around carefully. Nothing else was out of place. No broken branches or moved logs. Just those footprints. I felt a prick of fear I hadn't felt before. Someone had been here, nearby, watching. That day, I decided to go further into the woods. I needed to understand if anyone lived close by or if this was just some random visitor. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, a knife, and a flashlight. I followed the creek deeper into the forest, keeping my eyes open. The forest grew darker under the thick canopy. The trees were older here, some fallen and covered in moss. I came across an old campsite, an abandoned fire pit with cold ashes, some crushed cans, and scraps of torn fabric. It looked like someone had camped here not long ago. I felt uneasy. This was not a popular hiking spot, and I hadn't seen any other people since I arrived. On the way back, I noticed something else. A trail in the dirt, faint but clear. It wasn't an animal path. It looked like it was made by a person walking through. It led away from the creek toward the west, deeper into the woods. I thought about telling someone in town, but I didn't want to make a fuss. This was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. Still, I kept a closer eye on the cabin when I returned. That night, the footsteps returned, only closer this time. I lay in bed, heart pounding as the sound came right up to the porch and stopped. I held my breath, waiting for anything else, but nothing followed, just the silence afterward. The next morning, I found something that chilled me. A small pile of sticks and stones arranged neatly just off the edge of the porch. It looked deliberate, like a marker. I didn't know what to make of it. The rest of the day, I stayed near the cabin, trying to keep busy fixing things inside. I patched some holes in the floorboards, cleaned the stovepipe, and stacked more firewood inside. But my mind was restless. By the third night, I had trouble sleeping at all. The sounds outside were louder, branches snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I saw a shadow moving just beyond the trees when I looked out the window. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I thought about leaving, but I had no cell phone or way to call for help, and the car was still a good 20 minutes away down the gravel road. I started planning. I gathered supplies to leave early in the morning. But just before dawn, something happened. I woke up suddenly to a loud noise outside, something heavy falling on the porch roof, making the whole cabin shake. My heart slammed in my chest as I threw on my boots and grabbed a heavy stick I'd kept by the door. I opened the door just a crack and looked out. Nothing was there. The porch was empty except for some broken branches scattered across the boards. No sign of whoever was out there. That morning, I finally understood. This wasn't just some random trespasser or a hiker who wandered too close. Someone had been deliberately watching, maybe trying to scare me away or send a message. I packed everything fast, double-checking the locks and windows. As I drove away, the forest behind me looked quiet again, but I knew it wasn't. I knew someone had been close, watching me the whole time. Back in town, I told the sheriff what happened. They promised to check the area, but said these woods were remote and it was hard to patrol regularly. Still, I never went back. The cabin stayed empty after that. Every time I drive past the gravel road, I think about those footsteps at night and the silence that followed. And I realize some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, hide secrets you don't want to uncover. I didn't expect that one weekend would change how I felt about being alone forever. The year was 2018, and I was 27. My name is Jamie. I live in a small town in northern Maine, not far from the Canadian border. I work in a quiet office downtown, mostly dealing with papers and numbers. Nothing thrilling. I'm used to calm days and quiet nights, but sometimes I need to get away from people, phones, and noise. So, that October, when the trees were full of reds and yellows and the air smelled cold and fresh, I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods. It was a tiny place, about 2 hours from town, near a small lake called Pine Hollow. The cabin was old but solid, built mostly from darkwood logs, with a stone chimney and a small porch that looked out over the water. I found it online through a local rental site. The pictures made it seem peaceful and inviting. I packed some food, water, a few books, my camera, and my camping gear, then drove out early on a Friday morning. The drive itself was peaceful. The highway narrowed to a gravel road as I got closer to the cabin, and the trees on both sides grew taller and thicker. I could see deer tracks in the mud near the road and small birds darting between branches. The sky was cloudy but bright enough to keep the forest colors sharp. When I pulled up, the cabin looked even better than the pictures. There was a small dock stretching into the lake, and the water was clear and still. The only sounds were the wind brushing the leaves and the distant call of a crow. I unlocked the door, which creaked a little as I opened it, and stepped inside. The inside was simple but cozy. A wooden floor, a small kitchen area with a rusty stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a small wood-burning fireplace. Upstairs was a loft with a mattress and blankets. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a big box of firewood stacked near the door. It was perfect, exactly what I wanted. That first day, I spent hours walking around the lake, taking pictures of the trees and the water, watching how the wind moved the leaves. The air was sharp and cold, but not freezing. I made a fire in the fireplace that night and cooked a simple meal, some canned soup and bread. The fire crackled, and I sat in front of it with a blanket over my knees, reading one of my books until my eyes grew heavy. I slept well, though the night was darker and quieter than I was used to. No streetlights, no distant cars, only the soft sounds of the woods. When I woke early Saturday, I felt peaceful. I had planned to spend the day hiking in the forest behind the cabin. I wanted to see the old logging trails I had read about, winding through thick pine and maple trees. The hike was beautiful. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves. The air smelled earthy and fresh. I saw squirrels running up trees and the occasional woodpecker knocking at a tree trunk. The trail led me deeper and deeper until I came to a clearing. There, a fallen old log lay across a small creek, its water bubbling quietly. I stopped to take pictures and rest. After an hour or so, I started heading back, but I noticed the sky had grown heavy with clouds. A chilly wind picked up. I hurried back to the cabin, hoping to get there before dark. When I arrived, The sun was already low behind the trees, and the air was colder. That night, I built a bigger fire in the fireplace and cooked some pasta. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth. I noticed a faint noise outside, like rustling, but I thought it was just the wind or animals moving in the underbrush. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The cabin felt safe. But then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. A noise outside the cabin had caught my attention. It was soft, like footsteps on the porch. My heart started pounding. I stayed very still, listening. The noise stopped. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. I lay back down but couldn't sleep. The woods outside were dark and silent except for the occasional crack of a twig. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and looked out the window. The porch was empty. Nothing moved. The next day, I told myself to relax. I spent the morning reading and took more pictures outside. The woods looked calm in the daylight. I even sat on the dock, dipping my feet in the cold lake water. In the afternoon, I noticed some strange things. A few of my things were moved around. A pair of gloves I left on the table was now on the floor. A small rock I had placed on the windowsill was missing. At first, I thought maybe I had moved them and forgotten, but something felt off. I decided to explore a bit farther into the woods. I wanted to distract myself, clear my head. As I walked, the trees grew closer together, and the light dimmed under the heavy branches. After about 20 minutes, I came to an old, abandoned cabin. Its roof was partly collapsed, and the wood was gray and rotten. I shivered and quickly took some photos. The place had a strange feeling, like time had stopped there long ago. When I turned to leave, I thought I heard voices, soft, far away. But when I stopped and listened, there was nothing, just the wind. I shook my head and walked back faster. That evening, back at my cabin, I decided to leave the next morning, even though I still had one day left on my rental. I wasn't scared exactly, but I felt uneasy. The quietness had changed. The woods didn't feel welcoming anymore. That night was worse than the first. I woke up again to noises, this time more than one. Steps on the porch, the sound of someone moving near the windows. I sat up and shone my flashlight outside. There was nothing there. I walked around the cabin, checking all doors and windows again. Everything was locked tight. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I lay in bed listening to the sounds outside. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving beyond the trees through the window. My heart jumped. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to stay calm. Around 3 a.m., the power went out. Not that I had much electricity, but I did have some battery-powered lights. They all flickered off. The cabin went pitch black except for the moonlight filtering in through the windows. I could hear the wind howling, and the trees creaked under the pressure. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but no signal, no service. That was normal for the area, but in that moment, it made me feel more isolated. I sat by the fireplace and tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp from the rain that had started falling lightly outside. After several tries, I finally got a small flame going. The fire cast long shadows on the walls, making the room seem bigger and smaller at the same time. I decided to pack quietly. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was leaving in the dark. I moved slowly, gathering my things, ready to leave at first light. Then, something caught my eye through the window facing the lake. There was a figure standing at the edge of the trees across the water. It was hard to see in the shadows, but it was definitely a person. They stood perfectly still, watching the cabin. I froze, heart racing. I didn't know if they saw me or not. I didn't wait to find out. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my backpack, and slipped out the back door, careful not to make noise. I walked down to the dock, looked around quickly, and then jumped into my car, which I had parked a little way off the cabin. The drive back was tense. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights or a car following me. But the road was empty, silent. When I got to town, I stopped at a gas station, used the payphone to call a friend, and told them where I had been. The next day, I went to the local police station and reported what I had experienced. They said there had been some reports of trespassers in the area, people living off the grid and sometimes causing trouble for renters. They told me the forest had some people who didn't like visitors and might watch cabins from a distance. But they didn't find anyone that night. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone else being there when I was alone. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people and real fears. Since then, I've been more careful about where I go alone. I still love nature and quiet, but I always make sure someone knows where I am. The woods are beautiful, but they can be unforgiving, and sometimes they hide things you don't want to find. The cabin in Pine Hollow taught me that lesson the hard way. Even when there's no magic or monsters, being truly alone can be terrifying. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to escape the city for a while. I needed to get away from everything: the noise, the crowds, the constant rush of work and deadlines. I found a small cabin listed for rent in northern Minnesota, near the boundary of a large forest reserve. The place was far from any town or even a main road, nestled deep in the woods near a small, quiet lake called Cedar Hollow. The listing promised solitude, peace, and a chance to reconnect with nature. It sounded perfect. I was 28 then, working in a graphic design firm in Minneapolis, and felt like I had been losing myself to the city's pressure. I packed only the essentials: a couple of changes of clothes, my backpack with some food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my camera. I told no one I was going. I wanted complete silence. The drive itself was long, about 5 hours from the city. The last stretch was a dirt road winding through dense pines and firs. As I got closer, the trees grew taller and the air felt cooler, fresher. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small, wooden, with a green tin roof and a porch that faced the lake. It was simple but cozy, built sometime in the 70s, with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a sleeping loft above. There was no electricity or running water. The place relied on a well and a solar panel that powered just a few lights inside. The first day, I unpacked, stacked some firewood by the stove, and explored the area. The lake was quiet, glassy smooth, surrounded by wildflowers and tall grass. A family of ducks swam near the shore. The forest smelled of pine and earth. I set up a hammock between two sturdy trees and spent the afternoon reading and watching the sun dip behind the ridges. It felt peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The nights were cool and dark. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I kept a lantern on the porch and the fire going in the stove. The cabin creaked sometimes with the wind, but it was comforting in a strange way. I felt safe. On the second day, I decided to go for a hike deeper into the woods. I followed an old trail that wasn't marked on any maps, just a faint path where the grass was flattened and the trees stood wider apart. I wanted to see the forest beyond the lake, to find a spot untouched by people. As I walked, I noticed the forest grew thicker, darker. The sunlight barely touched the ground here, blocked by the tall trees. The air was cooler and damp. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing. The ground was covered in moss and pine needles. There was a fallen log that looked perfect to sit on. I rested a while and took pictures of the tiny mushrooms growing at the base of a tree, the spiderwebs glistening with dew. It felt remote, like I had stepped into another world. As I got up to leave, I noticed something strange. Off to the side, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, there was a small wooden box. It was old, with faded paint and rusty hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully pulled it out from under the leaves. The box was locked, but the lock was broken and hanging loose. Inside, I found a bundle of old papers and a small, weathered notebook. The papers were mostly yellowed newspaper clippings from decades ago. Most were about missing people, strange disappearances in the area, and some reports of thefts from cabins. The notebook was a journal written in neat handwriting. The entries were from someone named Frank, a man who lived in the forest in the 1950s. He wrote about his daily life, the animals he saw, and occasionally mentioned feeling like he was being watched. The The last entry was dated 1958 and ended abruptly with the words, "I think someone is near. I can hear footsteps in the dark." A chill ran down my spine. I put the box back where I found it, careful not to disturb anything else, and hurried back to the cabin. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. I shook off the feeling and reminded myself I was alone but safe. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every noise felt louder, the wind rattling the windows, the creaking of the old wood. I kept thinking about Frank's journal and the mystery it hinted at. Who was watching him? What happened to him? The thought was unsettling, but I told myself it was just some old story. The next morning, I decided to explore the lake shore more carefully. The water was clear and cold, perfect for swimming. I found a small pier made of rotting wood and sat at the edge, dangling my feet in the water. The sky was overcast, but the air still smelled fresh. While walking back toward the cabin, I noticed something odd by the path. Footprints. They were fresh, human footprints, bare feet, leading from the forest to the cabin. I froze. No one was supposed to be near here. I checked the cabin carefully, but the doors were locked as I left them. I spent the day on edge. I stayed inside mostly, keeping the fire going and watching the windows. I kept my phone close, but I had little signal. I tried to call for help, but the calls didn't go through. It felt like the world outside didn't exist here. That evening, I went outside to get more firewood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows. As I gathered sticks near the tree line, I heard a faint noise, like a twig snapping. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight into the woods, but saw nothing. My heart pounded. I decided to finish quickly and head inside. On my way back, I thought I heard footsteps again, slower this time, matching my pace. I stopped, waited, but the sound stopped too. The hairs on my neck stood up. Back inside, I locked every door and window and sat near the stove with a large knife I had brought for emergencies. I checked my supplies. There was enough food and water for a few more days. I was safe for now, I told myself. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin shuddered, and I heard tapping on the roof, maybe branches. But then, I heard it again, a slow knock at the front door. My breath caught. I stayed frozen, listening. Another knock. It was deliberate, slow, and steady. I didn't answer. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, knife in hand. The knocking stopped after a few minutes. I waited for what felt like hours, then silence. The next morning, I found something new outside, a note pinned to the door with a rusty nail. It said simply, "Leave." No name, no explanation. I knew I wasn't alone out here anymore. Someone was watching me, maybe had been all along. The journal, the footprints, the knocking, it all made sense now. But why? What did they want? I packed quickly that morning. I didn't want to wait around for answers or confront whoever was out here. As I drove away on the dirt road, the forest seemed to watch me go, quiet and unchanging. I called the local ranger station as soon as I reached a signal area. I told them about the footprints, the note, the strange noises. They said they would send someone to check the cabin, but warned me that the forest around Cedar Hollow had been a hotspot for trespassers and illegal hunters recently. Some of them were dangerous. I felt a mix of relief and fear. I had escaped whatever had been lurking out there, but I knew the forest held many secrets, some better left alone. The whole experience changed me. It taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people, the unknown dangers hiding in quiet places. I never went back to that cabin or that lake. I still think about Frank and wonder what happened to him. Maybe, like me, he found out some places aren't safe to be alone in. But I learned to listen to my gut, to trust the signs, and that sometimes the best choice is simply to walk away. It was the winter of 2003 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 27 at the time, working in the city as a graphic designer, and I desperately needed a break from everything. The endless noise, the constant rush, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in concrete and steel. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you don't find in any city park or suburban backyard. I found the cabin through a small local rental agency, a simple wooden structure with no phone, no electricity, and only a wood-burning stove for heat. The cabin sat by a frozen lake, surrounded by tall pines heavy with snow. The place looked perfect in the photos, rustic but solid. The kind of place where you could feel your heartbeat slow down just by stepping inside. I packed carefully, carrying only what I thought necessary. Thick clothes, food enough for the week, water, a flashlight with extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a small hand axe. No technology beyond the flashlight. No phone, no radio. Just me and the woods. The drive up was long, winding through snowy hills and dense forests. The last few miles were on a dirt road barely plowed, the tires crunching over frozen patches. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening more snow. When I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a strange mix of relief and something else. Unease, maybe, but I told myself it was just the cold biting my skin. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It had one main room with a simple table, 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner, and the wood stove sitting near the center. A narrow shelf held a few dusty books and some old cooking utensils. The window was thick with frost, and outside, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The frozen lake gleamed faintly under the dull sky. After unloading my bag, I set about making a fire. The wood was dry, and after a few strikes of the matches, the stove caught flame and began to warm the room. I peeled off my boots and heavy coat, letting the heat soak into my fingers and toes. The first night was silent, save for the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the wooden cabin settling against the cold. I had expected this kind of silence and welcomed it. No cars, no airplanes, no distant sirens, just the forest. But as the night deepened, I began to notice other sounds. The soft scraping of branches against the cabin walls. The occasional thud, like something heavy landing on the snow outside. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just animals moving around. Deer maybe, squirrels or owls. I forced myself to focus on the fire, the warm glow, the safety of the small room. The next morning, I woke early, the cold still biting at the edges of the cabin despite the stove's warmth. I dressed quickly in layers and stepped outside. The sky had cleared to a pale blue, and the sun cast long shadows between the trees. The snow was deep, crunching underfoot. I decided to take a walk around the lake, wanting to get my bearings. The woods were quiet but alive. I saw fresh tracks in the snow, deer or maybe a fox. The lake's surface was thick with ice, except for a small patch near the shore where the water bubbled faintly, breaking through the frozen crust. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest for a while, feeling a strange thrill at being so alone. Back at the cabin, I set about chopping more wood. It was hard work, the axe biting into the frozen logs with a satisfying crack. I stacked the wood neatly by the door, ready for the night. That evening, after supper, I sat by the fire reading one of the old books. It was a simple collection of local history and stories about the region. Nothing supernatural, nothing spooky, just plain facts and old tales. I felt calm and content, but as darkness fell outside, the noises returned. This time louder and closer, a sharp snap of a branch just beyond the window, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. My heart began to beat faster. I went to the window and peered out into the dark woods, shining my flashlight in short bursts. Nothing, just black shapes and snow. No sign of movement. I convinced myself it was the wind or some animal. Still, I locked the door carefully and moved my chair closer to the stove, trying to feel safe. The following days passed in a similar rhythm. I woke with the sun, chopped wood, collected water from a nearby spring, and explored small parts of the forest. The cold was constant, but the cabin was warm and sheltering. I cooked simple meals over the stove, drank hot tea, and read by the fire. The isolation was beginning to feel less like loneliness and more like peace. Yet each night, the strange sounds grew more frequent. I would hear footsteps circling the cabin, sometimes soft, sometimes heavy, as if someone was pacing outside. Branches snapped near the windows, and once I heard a low groan, almost like a person breathing heavily. I never saw anyone, though. No footprints besides mine. No voices, just the sounds. I told myself to stay calm, to not let fear take hold. After all, this was the wilderness. Animals made noises. The wind creaked the trees. Maybe the snow shifted. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing. On the fourth night, something changed. I had just put out the fire and climbed into bed when I heard a loud bang on the door. It was a heavy, solid thud that shook the wood. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then another thud, this time several in quick succession. Someone or something was hitting the door. I scrambled out of bed and grabbed the axe. Heart pounding, I looked out the window, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but still no one was there. The snow was fresh and untouched. I opened the door a crack, careful not to step outside. Nothing, no footprints, but I could see deep scratches along the door's frame. Long, jagged marks gouged into the wood, fresh and raw. I hadn't noticed them before. My hands trembled as I closed and locked the door again. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. The footsteps outside were louder, more deliberate. Sometimes I caught glimpses of dark shapes moving just beyond the tree line, always disappearing when I looked directly. The next morning, I found more signs of disturbance. The woodpile was scattered. Logs rolled into the snow. The small pile of kindling was smashed. The window nearest the door had scratches and claw marks along the frame. I started to feel truly afraid. Yet, there was no one to turn to. No phone, no neighbors, just the vast forest and the frozen lake. I thought about leaving, but the roads were blocked with snow. The rental agency had warned me about this possibility and said they might not be able to get to the cabin until spring thaw. So I stayed. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I piled logs against the door, nailed planks over the window frames, and made sure the stove was stocked with plenty of wood. I even set up a makeshift alarm with cans and string around the perimeter, hoping to hear if anyone came close. That night, the pounding on the door started again. Louder, more violent. I could hear something heavy trying to force the door open. I gripped the axe tightly, ready to defend myself. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I held my breath. Then, footsteps moved away into the forest. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. In the morning, I found a single set of footprints leading away from the cabin into the woods. Large boots, deep in the snow. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared near a bend in the trail. I was alone. For the next 2 days, the attacks stopped. No banging, no footsteps. The forest was quiet. I tried to convince myself I was safe, but on the last night, I heard something else. A faint tapping on the roof. Soft at first, then steady. Someone was walking on top of the cabin. I didn't know if it was an animal or a person. I grabbed the axe again and slowly opened the door, shining the flashlight up toward the roof. The moonlight was pale, but I could see no one. The tapping stopped abruptly. I climbed outside, looking around carefully. The snow was undisturbed except for my footprints. I looked up and saw something strange. Near the chimney, someone had thrown a bundle of sticks and twigs arranged like a crude nest. It looked deliberate. I picked it up, feeling my skin crawl. Inside were several small bones. Animal bones, I think, but arranged as if to send a message. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept, imagining all sorts of horrors lurking in the woods. In the morning, I packed quickly and started the long hike back to the road. The snow was softer now, and I could walk faster. I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid someone was watching. When I finally reached the dirt road, I saw tire tracks, fresh and deep. A pickup truck had come through recently. I stuck out my thumb, hoping someone would stop. After a long while, a ranger truck pulled over. I told him where I'd been. I still remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it was almost 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 27 years old. I had been feeling overwhelmed by the city life, the constant noise, and the endless stress of work and people. So, when I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods of northern Vermont, I jumped at the chance to get away for a week alone. The cabin was near a small, quiet lake surrounded by tall pine trees, far from any main roads or towns. The address said something like Hidden Pines Retreat, but it was really just a weathered old cabin built by some family decades ago, then left empty for years before being cleaned up for occasional rentals. I packed my backpack with essentials, some clothes, a few canned foods, water, a small gas stove, and a first aid kit. I also took a flashlight, a map of the area, and a pocket knife. The drive there was long but peaceful. As I got closer, the roads narrowed into gravel and dirt, and the trees crowded the sides of the path. The last part of the trip involved driving slowly down a steep hill before turning onto a narrow track that led to the cabin. When I first saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It had faded wooden walls, a crooked front porch with a loose railing, and windows covered in dust and grime. The roof sagged slightly, but the place seemed solid enough. The lake wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk through a clearing in the trees. There was no cell phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth. Dust floated in the weak sunlight coming through the windows. The floor creaked under my boots, and cobwebs hung in the corners of the ceiling. The furniture was sparse and old, a rickety table, a few folding chairs, a small wood stove in one corner, and a narrow bed with a thin mattress covered by a faded blanket. The walls were bare except for some rusty nails and a few patches where paint peeled away. I took a deep breath and set my backpack down. For a moment, I felt a chill, but I told myself it was just the new environment. I opened the windows to let fresh air in and unpacked the food and stove. My plan was simple. I would spend the week hiking, reading, fishing, and just being away from everything. No internet, no noise, no interruptions. That first night, the forest was silent except for the occasional call of a distant owl. I made a small fire outside on a cleared patch of ground, careful to keep it contained with rocks. The stars were bright, the sky clear. I cooked some canned beans and ate slowly, enjoying the peace. I fell asleep early, the cabin cold but safe. The next day, I explored the area. The woods were thick and smelled of pine and earth. I followed the lake's edge and found a small dock made of old wood planks. The water was clear and cold, reflecting the sky and trees like a mirror. I skipped some stones, watched a family of ducks swim, and felt a strange calmness settle over me. I told myself I could get used to this place easily. But then, on the third day, things started to feel different. I woke up to a loud banging sound, like something hitting the cabin's walls from the outside. My heart jumped. I looked out the window but saw nothing, only the dark trees swaying in the early morning breeze. I convinced myself it was probably a branch knocked loose by the wind or maybe a deer hitting the walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the day went on, the banging came and went. Sometimes it was soft, like tapping, other times harder, like someone pounding on the wood. I stayed inside most of the day, trying to keep calm. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The cabin felt smaller, more confining than before. That night, as I lay on the creaky bed, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, heavy steps moving around the cabin. I froze, heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. I reached for the flashlight on the floor beside me, but I didn't want to open the door to look. The steps stopped suddenly, then silence returned. I stayed awake the whole night, listening for any sound, my mind racing with every possible explanation. The next morning, I went outside to inspect. On the porch, I saw deep scratches on the wooden railing, as if someone or something had dragged their nails across it. On the ground, near the edge of the clearing, there were fresh footprints in the soft dirt, large, heavy, and not like any animal tracks I had seen before. The prints led away from the cabin into the woods, then disappeared. I took pictures with my phone, but there was still no signal, so I couldn't call for help. I debated packing up and leaving, but something made me stay. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the woods played tricks on the mind when you're alone and tired. That afternoon, while walking along the lake, I noticed something else. A small pile of broken branches and leaves near the water's edge. It looked like someone had hidden something there. Curious and uneasy, I pushed the branches aside and found a rusty old metal box, partially buried. The box was locked, but the padlock was broken. Inside, there were several old photos, faded and torn, showing the cabin and the surrounding forest from decades ago. There were pictures of a man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling in front of the cabin. But in some photos, the man's face was scratched out. One photo was crumpled and showed the family standing far away, and behind them, in the trees, a blurry dark figure appeared. I felt a cold shiver. Why would someone hide these pictures here? What story did they tell? I stuffed the box into my backpack and hurried back to the cabin. That night, I tried to sleep, but the banging returned, louder and more frequent. It sounded like someone was angrily hitting the walls, shaking the whole cabin. I wanted to believe it was just animals or wind, but the timing was too strange. The banging stopped suddenly, and then, outside the window, I heard breathing. Deep, slow breaths right next to the cabin. I stared at the window, frozen, unable to look away. Then, a shadow passed quickly across the glass. My flashlight's weak beam caught a glimpse of a tall figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my pocket knife and listening for any sound. When dawn finally came, the woods seemed calm again, but I felt drained and scared. Over the next 2 days, I found more signs someone had been near the cabin. Footprints in the mud around the building, fresh broken branches blocking the path I had used, and even marks on the door where a crowbar had been forced. But nothing was missing inside the cabin, and the doors were still locked every time I checked. I started to realize I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me, maybe even living in the woods nearby. The thought made me more nervous than anything else. I didn't know if this person was dangerous or just lonely and curious, but their presence was undeniable. On the 5th day, I decided I had to get help. I packed my things quietly before sunrise and prepared to leave. The drive back down the narrow roads felt tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car or a figure following me, but there was nothing. Still, I felt like someone was tracking me, staying just out of sight. When I reached the first town with a cell phone signal, I called the local police. I told them everything: the banging, the footprints, the box with old photos, the figure outside my window. They took me seriously and sent a team to check the cabin and surrounding woods. The police found something surprising: a small, hidden campsite about half a mile from the cabin, well camouflaged with branches and leaves. There were old food cans, a dirty sleeping bag, and a few makeshift weapons, broken sticks sharpened to points. They also found a man's journal, describing a man living in the woods for years after losing his family. The journal spoke of loneliness, anger, and fear of strangers. The police tried to find this man, but he was gone by the time they arrived. The footprints and signs of his presence stopped abruptly. They never caught him. After that, the cabin was cleaned and repaired, then rented out again with warnings about the area. I never went back, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I remember those banging sounds, the shadowy figure, and the quiet breathing just outside the window. That summer taught me a lot about fear, solitude, and the thin line between safety and danger in the wild. I learned that sometimes, the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but real people, lost and desperate, hiding in the shadows. The good ending is that I made it out safely, and no harm came to me. I was smart enough to leave before things got worse and brave enough to face the unknown. I reported everything to the police, and even though the man disappeared, at least I helped expose what was happening there. The experience changed me. I appreciate life more and respect the power of nature and human loneliness. Now, whenever I think about that cabin in Vermont, I remember not just the fear, but also the strength it took to survive and move forward. It was a scary time, but it ended clearly and safely. I'm still here and I'm okay. It was late October in 2013 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 28, tired of the noise of the city and the endless stress of work. I had spent years in a small tech company in Denver, Colorado, staring at screens and dealing with deadlines that never seemed to end. The city felt suffocating, and I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I could breathe and think. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin came to mind, and after some searching, I found a small, old cabin for rent near the edge of the White River National Forest, a few hours from Denver. The cabin was basic, no internet, no cell signal, just an old wooden structure with a stove, a small bed, and a little kitchen area. The kind of place that forced you to slow down and face yourself. I packed up my car with supplies, some canned food, a flashlight, a couple of books, a first aid kit, and my trusty old hunting knife, just in case. I told no one exactly where I was going, only that I was taking some time off. I didn't want anyone to worry. The drive up was long but peaceful. The trees were already turning shades of orange and red, the air crisp and fresh. As I got closer, the road narrowed and became rougher. Gravel and dirt replaced asphalt, and tall pine trees crowded both sides of the path. The closer I got to the cabin, the quieter the world became, save for the occasional sound of birds or the wind rustling through the branches. When I finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow clearing, surrounded by dense forest on three sides. The clearing was large enough for a small garden and a fire pit. The cabin itself was weathered, the wood faded and cracked in places. The porch sagged a little, and the windows were thick with grime. But there was something peaceful about it, the kind of peace you only find far from civilization. I unloaded my car and took a long look around before stepping inside. The interior smelled of old wood and dust, with a faint trace of mildew. The air was cold, even though it was still daylight. I started a small fire in the stove to warm the place up, unpacked my things, and settled in. That first night, I slept fitfully. The silence was overwhelming, every little creak and crack of the cabin sounding loud and eerie. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and at one point, I heard the distant howl of a coyote. I told myself it was just nature and tried to focus on the quiet. I read a little, ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, and finally drifted off to sleep. The next day, I explored the surrounding forest. The air was cold but clear, the ground covered in fallen leaves. I followed a small trail for a few miles, the sun filtering through the trees. It was beautiful but also isolated. I didn't see another person or sign of any recent human activity. I gathered some dry wood for the fire and headed back to the cabin before dark. As the days passed, the loneliness started to creep in. The silence wasn't just peaceful anymore. It was heavy. My phone had no signal, and I wasn't in any mood to read all the time. I started hearing noises at night, footsteps outside, the snap of twigs, the rustling of leaves. I reminded myself that the forest was full of animals, and that any sound was probably a deer or a raccoon moving around. Still, something about it didn't feel right. On the fourth night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps close to the cabin. They weren't the light, quick steps of a small animal. They were slow and deliberate, heavy. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped near the porch, and I heard a soft scraping noise, like someone dragging something over the wooden floorboards outside. I wanted to turn on the porch light, but the switch didn't seem to work. The cabin's electricity was barely functional, and I hadn't brought any extra batteries for my flashlight. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to stop and disappear. Eventually, the footsteps faded, replaced by the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. I checked the door, it was locked tight, the windows all shut. Nothing seemed disturbed inside. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal walking on the porch, but it didn't explain the scraping noise. The next morning, I found something strange on the porch. A small pile of dry leaves and dirt pushed up against the door. It looked like someone had swept it there on purpose. I brushed it away and checked around the cabin carefully, but I saw no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I decided to stay calm and ignore it. Maybe a hiker had passed by during the day and left it there, or maybe the wind had piled the leaves just so. I was alone, and paranoia was starting to get the better of me. On the 5th day, I went for a longer walk, hoping to clear my head. I followed a different trail that led uphill through thick forest. After about an hour, I found an old, abandoned hunting cabin. It was smaller than mine and falling apart, but it was a clear sign someone had been here before. The door hung open, and inside I saw an old, rusty stove and some broken furniture. There were scraps of paper on the floor, yellowed with age, but I didn't want to touch anything. It was a reminder that the forest had history. People came and went, sometimes left in a hurry. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed my firewood stack was disturbed. Some logs had been moved, shifted around. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I was sure I had stacked them neatly the night before. I locked the door and windows, checked the cabin thoroughly. I had my knife close by on the table. The wind was picking up outside, and the darkness fell fast. At around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. They circled the cabin slowly, moving in patterns, stopping now and then. There was something different this time, the sound of something metal clinking softly, like keys or chains. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed frozen, clutching my knife, my breath visible in the cold air. The footsteps stopped near one window, and I heard a soft tapping. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated into the woods. The next morning, I noticed scratch marks on the cabin door frame, thin but deep, as if someone had tried to force the door open or claw at it. My heart sank. I wasn't alone here. Someone else was in these woods, watching me. I packed up most of my supplies and decided I couldn't stay another night. I had to get out. The problem was the road. A heavy rainstorm had rolled in overnight and turned the dirt road into a muddy mess. My car was stuck deep in the mud when I went out to leave. I tried pushing it, rocking it back and forth, but it wouldn't budge. I was stuck. Panic started to set in. The idea of being trapped in the cabin with whoever or whatever was outside was terrifying. I grabbed my flashlight, knife, and a small bag with some water and food, deciding to walk out on foot. The nearest ranger station was about 10 miles away, along the main road. The trail was rough and the forest thick. The wind had died down, but the air was heavy, like the forest itself was watching me. The walk was exhausting. The mud sucked at my boots, and branches scraped my face. I kept hearing noises all around, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I dared not stop. I kept telling myself that no one was following me, that these were just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. After a few hours, I finally reached the main dirt road. It was empty and quiet. I started walking along it, hoping to see a car or some sign of civilization. Then I heard a shout, not a friendly call, but something sharp and angry, coming from the trees behind me. I froze. The sound was too close to be an animal. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran until I saw headlights approaching, a pickup truck driving slowly toward me. I flagged it down, relieved beyond words. The driver was a middle-aged man, friendly but surprised to see me out there. He gave me a ride to the ranger station where I explained what had happened. The rangers took me seriously. They said that sometimes, people looking for solitude end up crossing paths with others who live off the grid, or with hunters who don't like strangers near their territory. They said some had even been known to intimidate or scare off visitors. They organized a search for my car, which was stuck on the muddy road near the cabin, and for whoever might have been following me. A few days later, the search teams found signs of someone camping nearby. A small fire pit, some discarded cans, and footprints. But the tracks stopped abruptly in the woods. There was no sign of anyone threatening or dangerous, no weapons or anything suspicious. They suggested I stay away from the area for a while. I left the cabin behind and never went back. But the experience stayed with me. I learned something about isolation, about how fear can creep in when you are truly alone, and about how humans, not monsters or ghosts, can sometimes be the scariest part of the wilderness. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the dark, but what people can do when they think no one is watching. Since then, I've appreciated the city noise a little more and the safe